Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Spaceflight Now's live coverage of the latest mission from Starbase, Texas, as SpaceX is preparing for the 12th integrated test flight of its Starship Super Heavy rocket. You're looking live down there at Pad 2, the first time that SpaceX is set to launch a Starship rocket from this particular piece of Starbase, having retired Pad 1 for the time being, as it will make modifications to make it more like Pad 2 as the company works towards a rapid launch and relaunch cadence across both sites and elsewhere here in the United States and eventually potentially around the world. This is the brand new demonstration of SpaceX's launch vehicle as well, Starship. You're looking at Ship 39 up top, Super Heavy booster tail number 19 down below. Lots of things to talk about as far as SpaceX's upgrades and updates to the program, and we've got about 2 hours to do so before the opening of the launch window. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Will Robinson-Smith, reporter with Spaceflight Now, joining you from here in Florida as we've got close eyes down there in Texas. Those views you were just seeing, courtesy of our friends with Avid Space, formerly Lab Padre, and we'll be joined a little bit later with views from our friends Chuck and Jen Briggs as well. Lots to see, lots to talk about here, and if you saw our tweet earlier in the day, we're also going to be joined by a couple of special guests. Micah Maidenberg, reporter with the Wall Street Journal, and Stephen Clark of Ars Technica, formerly with us here at Spaceflight Now. And as you can see with the clock in the upper right-hand corner of your screen, SpaceX is currently T-minus 1 hour, 57 minutes, 16 seconds, and counting to the planned liftoff of this now more than 400-foot tall rocket, with the additions and the changes that have been made since they first started launching the integrated vehicle. This is now, once again, the newest, tallest rocket launching anywhere in the world. Take a look at the view from Chuck and Jen Briggs here. The skies look pretty nice from this perspective. However, SpaceX has been keeping a close eye on the weather. Early today, the company forecast a roughly 55% chance for liftoff, but as the hours ticked by today, conditions dropped down to below a coin toss. Jesse Anderson with the company is saying it's about 45% favorability, and you can see part of the reason why that is. You're looking live from the latest weather loop, courtesy of one of the GOES satellites from NOAA. I believe this is GOES East. The area of concern right now is just north of the U.S.-Mexico border. That's where Starbase is located, formerly incorporated as a city there in South Texas. Starbase now, not just the name of the production site for SpaceX, but a fully functioning town. Since SpaceX last launched a flight of their Starship vehicle, that was the 5th and final flight of the second big block iteration of the launch vehicle. SpaceX flew Block 2, or version 2, a total of 5 times, from Flight 7 through Flight 11. Of course, the year started off on a bit of a rocky note, with Flights 7 and 8 both having issues not too long into flight before the ship made it much further beyond the mouth of the Gulf. Things picked up as SpaceX continued to fly Block 2 of their Starship rocket, and then by the end of the year, with Flight 11 in October of 2025, they pretty much had a successful flight from what they were looking for, getting the ship to fly around most of the world, splashing down in the Indian Ocean, as this ship will again today. Super Heavy booster, having proven that SpaceX can refly one of their Super Heavy boosters, also getting that expertise under their belt, making Starship a little more Falcon-like in its sense of reuse. Over the years, SpaceX was able to reuse Raptor engines as well as the Super Heavy booster, but of course, the crown jewel, if you will, of the Starship program will be the full reuse of the rocket and eventually being able to catch both the booster as well as the ship upper stage. Neither will be attempted today. This is a fully suborbital flight with no attempt to recover the Super Heavy booster or the ship upper stage. SpaceX made that call because this is such a new piece of hardware that they're flying today. Lots of hardware upgrades, some software upgrades, changes to the avionics, the flight infrastructure that is supporting the mission. As mentioned, this is the first time that Pad 2 is coming into use as well. So lots that SpaceX wants to learn about how this all melds together, not just in a static fire test environment or a wet dress, which we've seen SpaceX do now a couple of times with the fully integrated stack. Most recently, they did what appeared to be a partial wet dress rehearsal, not fully tanking the vehicle as they had previously on Monday the 11th. SpaceX did not say whether that was an intentional partial wet dress or if they had to pause and abort for reasons not yet disclosed at this point in time, but we'll see how they progress in tanking today. And of course, we'll be along with you throughout the course of the journey. And we're glad that now more than 2,000 of you are along for the ride with us at this point in the count. If you haven't already, you could do us a big favor just by clicking the like button and sharing the stream, allowing some more folks to find their way into this live launch coverage. Here in the chat, we're joined by our moderators, M. Teresa. And I believe I saw Jeff Hansen in here, but that may have just been a recall from earlier today. Of course, this is our second launch that we're covering for you on the channel today. We certainly appreciate those early birds who got up with us this morning to watch a gorgeous launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket from here in Florida. That mission carried a batch of 29 Starlink V3 mini-optimized satellites into low Earth orbit, successfully deploying those Starlinks into LEO, adding to the more than 10,000 strong that are currently on orbit. Of course, Starship, one of its main promises for the company, is the ability to deliver version 3 of the Starlink satellites, the broadband variety, the ones that are generally thought of when you think of the Starlink constellation. But of course, another big and growing part of the business enterprise for SpaceX is having the direct mobile, or what they've rebranded Starlink Mobile, essentially. And that's a direct partnership with a number of classic telecom companies, such as T-Mobile here in the United States, I believe O2 in the UK, and several others around the world. And the goal is to help augment classical cell service and coverage on the ground and be able to offer augmented and supplemental cell signal in areas that are harder to reach with traditional infrastructure. But what SpaceX is hoping and is promising with the what they're calling the V2 version of the direct-to-cell version of the Starlink satellites is basically to have Starlink quality broadband internet be available on your phone regardless of where you are in the world. But that capability, they're saying, is possible with the next generation of these Starlink mobile satellites, which are only capable of being launched on Starship. So from a company financial perspective, a lot's riding for SpaceX on this, and a lot's been promised and has been worked towards by the engineering team at the company, of course, both down there at Starbase and around the country. Here in Florida, they have what's called the bakery, which is where they go through the process of manufacturing the heat shield tiles that are used to coat the Starship rocket, or the upper stage. And in fact, if we can go to the slightly tighter view of the ship upper stage, I want to point something out that'll come into play later on in the mission once the rocket lifts off. If you look in this camera's perspective, you can see what appear to be missing tiles on the ship, when actually those are a series of heat shield tiles that were intentionally painted white. There are a series of 20 dummy Starlink satellites that are on this mission, similar to what we saw SpaceX deploy back during Starship flights 10 and 11. But in addition to those dummy satellites, which are essentially just big pieces of steel that are meant to replicate the size and the mass of a Starlink V3 satellite, there are two that will be deployed after all of those get released, and those have imaging capabilities on board. And the idea is that they'll be able to release those and beam back images of the heat shield as it's in flight, so that SpaceX engineers can get good real-time on-orbit visual data of how their heat shield is performing, not just when it's coming back from its coast phase and going back through the atmosphere, but during that early coast phase. The Starlink satellite deployment period will start about 17 minutes or so before or after liftoff, and will last about 10 or so minutes in duration. Like we've seen with previous Starship flights, there will also be an attempt to relight one of the Raptor engines on board the ship upper stage. And that's in order to demonstrate the future ability of the upper stage to be able to perform a deorbit burn, since of course you don't want a massive object this large to be an uncontrollable piece of space junk in low Earth orbit that could be quite threatening to a number of satellites in that space. And so, of course, they want to make sure that they can safely deorbit Starship before they do orbital flights, and there are a number that are on the table. Of course, one of the ones that NASA is watching for very closely coming up, potentially by the end of this year, but maybe early next year, will be ship-to-ship propellant transfer demonstration, which is where we'll see one Starship in just a tanker configuration head up into low Earth orbit and essentially loiter there, and then another Starship rocket will launch, dock with it, and then offload some amount. We don't know exactly if they're going to do perfect, entirely complete prop transfer during that demonstration, but they'll be transferring some amount of liquid oxygen and liquid methane from the docking ship to the tanker. And then for the future Artemis architecture, as well as other deep space missions like to Mars, for example, then SpaceX would eventually do this multiple times to be able to fully load the tanker, then offload that propellant to, for the Artemis program, it would be the human landing system version of the Starship upper stage that would then go out to the moon to meet the Orion spacecraft. Or that version of Starship would then head on out to Mars. Time now currently T-minus 1 hour, 45 minutes, about 46 seconds in total. The timeline for this mission is a little bit different than we've seen for previous Starship flights. The last time we saw a flight of this rocket, or the version 2 iteration in Flight 11, the SpaceX call for the start of prop load came about an hour and 15 minutes prior to fueling. This time, it's just 15 minutes ahead of time, and teams will start loading the rocket up with its cryopropellant at T-minus 38 minutes, 53 seconds. And unlike the last time we saw it fly, where they started with ship fuel, the liquid methane, this time they're going to start with the liquid oxygen on the ship, then locks on the booster, and then transition to start loading the fuel on just under 35 minutes before the rocket is set to fly. SpaceX should be giving views of the Starship rocket from multiple angles beginning about 45 minutes or so prior to the liftoff of this rocket. But again, the views that you're looking at right now are coming to us courtesy of our friends over at Avid Space. Some of you may previously have known them as gosh, just blanked on the name. It's been Avid Space in my mind now for a minute. Lab Padre. Thank you, John. Our photographer, John Pisani, is thankfully on headset in my ears so that when my brain, which has been going since 4 a.m. this morning for the Starlink launch, stutters a little bit. We've got some backup here. So I should mention our Spaceflight Now editor, Stephen Young, is also running the technical operations of our broadcast today alongside John Pisani, and we certainly appreciate the both of them for holding it down on the technical front, since there are always gremlins that come up when it comes to trying to launch a Starship rocket, whether it's from the broadcast side or from the launch side. So it's always good to have well-versed technical minds working technical issues in the background. In just about 13 or so minutes, we will be joined by our first guest of the broadcast. Micah Maidenberg of the Wall Street Journal will be hopping on board, and couldn't come at a better time since yesterday was the publication by the U.S. Security and Exchange Commission of SpaceX's first foray and announcement, really, of detail that concerns their initial public offering, which is expected in the mid-June timeframe. Just to put this out there, and you know, we'll mention this when we have Micah on as well. Of course, typically speaking, when we have our launches, I'll have my usual preamble about what to do and what not to do in the live chat, so that our mods have an idea of what is and is not permissible, and we usually include something along the lines of, you know, please don't delve into topics of overt politics or religion, and that is still true. We'd ask that you still respect that guideline. However, of course, we're going to be talking about the IPO for SpaceX and a lot on the business side, and it's a really big space story. Of course, we don't want to downplay the importance of what is happening right now, what is going to be happening in the months and years to come, since the company that's been around for about 20 years being taken public for the first time, especially one that has as much prominence in the launch space as well as operating the vast majority of satellites in low Earth orbit, is certainly going to generate a lot of conversation. So just to let you know, in the chat, talking about the IPO, about the financials, and you know, all of that, that's fine. We just ask that you couch that in our other request, which is to be understanding of where other folks are coming from. The fact that, you know, Mr. Musk is not purely isolated to rocketry or to his endeavors with Tesla or XAI or his other business ventures that are tied into this IPO. And so we would just ask that you try to segment the conversation and keep this chat space to be more specifically about things connected to SpaceX, to XAI, to the things that tie into the conversation as it's germane for this, and also just to avoid personalities, ad hominems, and, you know, treat each other with a level of respect that you yourself would like to be treated. Time now T-minus 1 hour, 40 minutes, 18 seconds and counting. If you look right about the middle of the tower there, you can see a bit of venting there across from the ship fuel lines, similar to SpaceX preparing to load liquid oxygen on board a Falcon 9 or Falcon Heavy rocket. Same principles of LOX load apply here to the Starship vehicle. They need to make sure that those feed lines are at the right temperature to allow the LOX to flow smoothly, and so that there aren't any hardware issues on the way in. Time now T-minus 1 hour, 36 minutes, 13 seconds, and counting. As we mentioned earlier in the broadcast, the introduction of Starship version 3 has a lot of weight, of course, for SpaceX in its own enterprise, but this is the version of the rocket that will be evolved into the human landing system iteration of the Starship upper stage. That is the HLS lander component, which will be used during the Artemis program to bring astronauts from lunar orbit down to the surface of the moon and back up again. Prior to the launch of Artemis 2, we actually had the opportunity to sit down with the deputy program manager of the HLS program. You'll be hearing from Dr. Kent Shinaki. He is up at the Marshall Space Flight Center most of the time, but traveled down to the Kennedy Space Center again in the run-up to Artemis 2, which was when we had this conversation back on March 30th. So I want to play that for you now in full. This is our conversation with Dr. Kent Shinaki about where things stand with the human landing system, both for SpaceX as well as the other HLS provider, Blue Origin. Well, Kent, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. It's a busy time, certainly in your office, as it is here at the Kennedy Space Center with announcements happening in the vehicle assembly building, but appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you for having me.
And, you know, it's obviously a time of a lot of change, especially concerning the Human Landing System program, with the announcements from the administrator of a different style of mission for Artemis 3. I wonder, as you're starting to lay the groundwork for those plans, how your office is adapting to these big changes.
So we're really excited about another opportunity to fly in Earth orbit. So we have the direction to do one or either both providers on an Earth orbit rendezvous with Orion in 2027. So we're excited about that. We have put task orders to both providers to be able to give us their ideas of what they're capable of. And we have a little bit of work going on to see what they can do together. Because we could have one mission with a SpaceX and an Orion. We have another mission with a Blue Origin and Orion. But the request is we could do a 3-launch scenario where we have Blue Origin, SpaceX, and Orion all launching and doing at least prox ops, if not docking and crossing a hatch. So we're pretty excited about the opportunity.
Exciting, but certainly challenging, I'm sure, logistically, to figure out which version of this campaign is best suited for this mission, I imagine.
Absolutely challenging, and that work is still underway.
And when do you expect to get those, finalized proposals from SpaceX and Blue Origin that'll help set the table for that?
The task order will be over in April, and then we're going to have to take all that data and consolidate it and work with our friends in Orion and see what really is capable. So I don't have a timeline on it, but we are going to be responding to the 2027 mission.
And, as this early test campaign is going on, it also creates a new opportunity for 2028, as the administrator mentioned, with one, potentially 2 landings that year. How are you starting to think about, a reimagined Artemis 4 as well, without the gateway in the loop and, having either the Blue Moon Mark II or the Starship meet Orion out in lunar orbit?
So our plan had always been for the first SpaceX mission to be a direct dock with Orion. So that's not a big pivot. For Blue Origin, this is a new interface. They always had the requirement to dock to Orion in the case of an emergency, but this is a new standard orbit for a new standard interface for them. And so we have to work through that and get new requirements to both sides of that, Orion and Blue Origin. We are really excited about the opportunity to try early 28, late 28 with both providers. We have asked them for acceleration ideas, and they have come back with some really bold ideas to be able to go meet this 28 mission. And so we are still working with both of them. We're looking at what is possible to go do, and so we're working with both of them.
And of course, a big requirement of that is to have both of them do an uncrewed landing demonstration, then ascent from the lunar surface. How far ahead of those Artemis 4 and 5 missions do they need to perform those uncrewed landing demos for you to have time to assess the data and make that plan?
I don't have a specific time. They absolutely have to do the uncrewed demo. They absolutely have to land and show an ascent profile prior to us being able to manifest that and put crew on the vehicle. And so we don't have a timeline on it, but I agree with you. We're going to have time to manifest, to understand it, to ingest it, and to be able to use any data that we have from that to learn from and make any design modifications that are necessary.
Correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I believe the requirement for SpaceX's lander that they didn't have to do a demonstration of the elevator system in the uncrewed demo. Is that still the plan? And if so, how are you buying down risk on the elevator portion that is so crucial to a Starship landing?
You are correct in that we do not require that they have the elevator on the uncrewed demo. We are working with them. We have we have a chief engineer within the HLS program who has proposed some ideas, and the program is funding some risk reduction ideas to go do some work in-house on behalf of a provider, and the elevator is on that list for consideration that we want to go look at.
I believe it was about a year and a half or so ago that there was a cool integrated test with mock-up of the HLS Starship module along with the Axiom suits as they were at that time. Do you imagine that there may be another type of joint interface testing that will happen in between now and when those missions fly?
I think several. I think we'll be doing that several times in several different scenarios. Each of our providers is required to have a mock-up of the fidelity of their crew cabin and of their crew quarters. And so we have received a Blue Origin mid-fidelity mock-up that's currently at Johnson Building 9 that we can do some human loop testing in. And we have, for SpaceX, they are building their first engineering model of the crew cabin. So it is building off of engineering drawings. It's of similar construction standards as from flight, and it will be a full crew cabin, including the ecosystem and any crew cabin, crew quarters, crew interface, and the like. So it's going to be really pretty good, and that has begun at Boca Chica.
Last question, because I know a lot of folks are eager to have some of your time today, but can you give us a little bit of a roadmap for 2026? What are you watching to see from SpaceX? What are you watching for from Blue Origin?
So Blue Origin is really working hard on their independently developed their Mark 1. And so they are currently trying to land a Mark 1 on the moon in 2026. And while that is not a Artemis mission, we can do a ton of learning from it, all the way from the systems and their BE-7 engine through the landing and the plume surface interaction and the Scalps camera, which is a CLIPS payload on that. So we have a ton of learning from there. And for SpaceX, we're looking at 3 major milestones in this year. One is they have the version 3 ship that is going to launch hopefully in April. And that is going to be the first version that is going to be close to the HLS Starship. Second, they want to do orbital flight, this next step. And then third is they're going to do long duration testing and propellant transfer. And so that is you launch a Starship, you keep it in orbit for 10 days, 2 weeks, that kind of period. And then you launch a second Starship and fill the first Starship as a representative depot. That's going to be a key technology to being able to get to uncrewed demo and eventually human landing.
Is there a ballpark on how many flights it'll take to fill the depot?
We're still learning about that. We have to do it once before we can do it more than once, and we're going to use that data to kind of drive that.
Ken Chinaki, Deputy Program Manager for the HLS program. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you for having me.
And that was Dr. Ken Chinaki with the Human Landing System program. Again, that interview being conducted in the run-up to the Artemis 2 mission. And worth noting that coming up on Tuesday, NASA has announced that they will be holding a news briefing up at the NASA headquarters in DC, where they'll be talking about the latest on the moon base and made some reference to subject matter experts being there, but didn't disclose exactly who. SpaceX did retweet that. I think I saw that Mr. Musk did retweet that, says, sounds exciting or something to that effect. So maybe hearing something about the lunar terrain vehicles, maybe something with the landers. We'll just have to wait and see how that materializes. But in the meantime, where we are right now with the Starship launch, we are currently T-minus 1 hour, 26 minutes, 44 seconds and counting to the planned liftoff of this vehicle, or at least that's the time to the opening of the launch window today, which runs 90 minutes in total. So if SpaceX needs to move that back at some point, will let you know if they make further adjustments. But right now, they're still moving towards the window opening. And as we're getting closer to liftoff, of course, we've talked a little bit about where things stand with the rocket right now, but we've also teased a little bit about some of the big news that came out yesterday. SpaceX's big opening salvo to their initial public offering, which is where SpaceX will be for the first time going public with the company. And we are grateful at this point in the broadcast to be joined by a reporter who I consider a friend at this point and a seasoned journalist over at the Wall Street Journal, covers the space beat excellently, Mr. Micah Maidenberg. Micah, it's good to see you, buddy. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Will. Thanks so much for having me on and for all those kind words. Yeah, it's great to be back.
Well, and for anyone who's checked out the Wall Street Journal, either in print or digital within the last 24 hours, you've seen Micah's byline at least a handful of times. It's something that you and your colleagues, Micah, have been building towards for a while now, which is tracking the progress of SpaceX going public. And for our audience, before we get into the meat and potatoes of it all,
Yeah.
for folks that aren't as familiar with you and your work, can you just give them the Reader's Digest of how you became involved in covering space, since we all have our own unique paths to this position? And when you first started covering space, what did SpaceX feel like to you at the time?
It's a great question. I've been covering space for almost 5 years at this point, and I sort of stumbled into this job in some ways. I was wanting to get a new job internally at the Journal after doing a gig for a few years, and I ended up writing about getting the kind of space job. And it's only the beat has become just kind of bigger and bigger, kind of with each year that I've been on it. And it in some ways it's kind of like the SpaceX started, filing this IPO document yesterday is sort of a culmination in a certain kind of way of, tracking the company and thinking about what they're doing and where they're going. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into the space beat and started covering this.
And 5 years ago, that was right around the early stages of when SpaceX was
Yeah.
starting to deploy the Starlink constellation, just starting to get that service up and running. And now, for the first time, we've got a lot of detail about what their business looks like behind the scenes. Putting dollars and cents to all of the different pieces of what SpaceX is now, and we can see how much of an important part the Starlink constellation really is.
Yeah, and sorry to go back to your original question. Like 5 years ago, SpaceX was, of course, a very dominant company already, launching frequently, and really, I think part of like the story over the last 5 years has been this sort of Falcon 9 Starlink ramp. The launches have gone up so much, as down in Florida, the constellation has built out, and that customer sort of base for Starlink has grown. So that's been a huge sort of topic of coverage for me, for us over the last few years. And like you said, we have like a lot of detail now about what that ramp for Starlink looked like. 10 million subscribers as of the end of March. It is the sort of financial engine of the company right now, with really significant revenue, and just gives SpaceX a lot of resources to kind of pursue some of the bigger goals that are laid out in that document and so on.
Yeah, and just to give folks some context for what Starship or Starlink represents for the company, I was just going back and referencing my stats here. There were about 120 dedicated Starlink launches back in 2025, where they deployed in excess of 3,100 satellites. So far this year, they've already launched 46 dedicated Starlink missions, more than 1,200 added into low Earth orbit so far this year. So they've been keeping up a very steady clip of that. And one of the things that I think jumped out to certainly me and to a number of our colleagues was the percentage of their overall launch that is segmented to their Starlink satellites and then the rest of the customers, and how much importance they're putting in that first bucket.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the part of what has made Starlink work, and part of what has made it so powerful, is just that that vertical integration, as it's called. It used to be like a satellite developer, a constellation developer would build the satellites, focus on the satellites, and then go out and find a rocket company to launch the satellites. But SpaceX sort of did it all in house, and that has worked certainly to their advantage in making Starlink economically viable and again, this like big driver for the company overall.
And looking at the S1 document that was published yesterday, I mean, you and your colleagues have had a chance to really comb through it a lot, and I think there are things that we'll keep going back and finding as we continue to sit with it a little bit longer. But
Yeah.
Maybe starting out at a high level, what were some of the things that really jumped out to you immediately? I mean, before we popped on the mic here, you were mentioning during that package with Kent playing that the Anthropic piece was really quite a notable headline in your mind, right?
Yeah, I mean, Will, we were talking about how SpaceX has sort of changed over the last 5 years, and that's, I mean, very simply, and your viewers know this, like one of the big changes is SpaceX is now an AI company, in addition to being a space company, and a big part of the company's future is sort of this idea that space and AI will have this kind of convergence. So earlier this year, SpaceX and Anthropic announced this deal where Anthropic would pay SpaceX, right, to use some of their AI computing capacity that XAI, which of course is now part of SpaceX, developed for itself when it was a separate company. And that Anthropic deal is also just a major driver now for SpaceX's overall revenue. And I think the size of that deal definitely jumped out to a lot of folks, and I took note of it myself, for sure.
Yeah, and the synergy between Mr. Musk's various companies, I think, was always something that seems like it was going to factor in, as we've seen some crossover between the use of planes between SpaceX and Tesla, of course the large acquisition of the Cybertruck by SpaceX. I mean, for folks that have visited here in Florida or go down to Starbase, I mean, certainly a Starbase, when you go down State Road 4 on your way to the beach, there's a whole Starbase sign that's got a line of parking spaces that is exclusively for the Tesla vehicles. So, just seeing that in black and white, did anything surprise you about the level of current and potentially future synergies between all of Musk's various ventures that we're seeing, at least at this point?
Yeah, I mean, my colleague who covers Tesla had a short post yesterday, kind of reflecting that Cybertruck news. That SpaceX had purchased or spent $131 million last year on purchasing Cybertrucks from Tesla. I think some of the collaboration between SpaceX and Tesla, it is already out there. A few more details, of course, yesterday, including Terafab. This is this joint venture between SpaceX and Tesla to build a chip fabrication factory, this big complex in Texas to produce chips that would be used on artificial intelligence satellites, on for Tesla cars. So SpaceX and Tesla are certainly have some very close ties, and the Cybertruck deals are sort of one sort of example of that, and the Terafab project is going to be a big one too.
And of course, part of the use case for those chips will be factored into the Starlink version 3 satellites, the upcoming V2 mobile, and of course just the overall architecture of Starship so far. One of the things, if folks want to read more of Micah's reporting, by the way, we've got some of those articles linked in the description of this live stream, so you can go ahead and peruse those, maybe pull something up while we're talking if you want to get a little side-by-side there. But, it was notable, I think, for folks to be able to see just how much so far SpaceX has invested in Starship R&D. They quoted about 15 billion so far, and a few billion of that just in the first quarter of this year alone, with about, what was it, just under 4 billion in 2025. Did that surprise you, just how much they've invested in capital expenditure for the
In
Starship program in
R&D.
such a
Yeah.
small time frame?
Well, yeah, I mean, and um, one of the things that's really fascinating about the S1, about this investor document, is just SpaceX very plainly saying that Starship is key to the company's like growth in the future. Like a lot of what SpaceX wants to do runs through Starship. Whether it's, like you said, that the V3 Starlink satellites, launching those, getting that going, and of course this bigger ambition to do this artificial intelligence satellite constellation. All of that runs through Starship, and that maybe that's a good segue to talk about the flight today a little bit. But I was yeah, fascinated by that, and I guess we'll see some of the fruits of that in one way or the other in the flight today. I believe the company also talked about looking to accelerate Starship work. Just checking myself here.
Mm-hmm.
Again, sort of like reflecting how important the vehicle is to its like broader, ambitions for space and AI, and how those, may converge.
Yeah, I mean, they really said in no uncertain terms that, you know, the timeline that they have for the success of this company in a lot of different venture areas is contingent on getting Starship into an orbital configuration, is being able to deploy these V3 satellites for the broadband connectivity.
Let me read
Oh,
this
yeah,
just
please.
from the company. It says, quote, "Our growth strategy depends on our ability to increase our launch cadence and payload capacity, which is dependent on the successful development of Starship at scale." So that's in a kind of description of like the space business um, for SpaceX, which is distinct from connectivity and AI. But that kind of gives you a flavor or a sense of like how leaders and engineers and technicians have got to be thinking about this vehicle. It's got to work at scale. That means a lot of launches and a lot of deployments.
Yeah, I mean, they've talked about, somewhere on the order of, thousands of launches within 5 years time frame, which,
Yeah.
just thinking about the cadence of launch right now with their Falcon rockets, and then, plus that up, 10 times, just really hard to wrap your mind around. And like you said, there's a good segue to talk about the vehicle that we've got here. Just off to my right, as you're looking at the screen, of course, this is a lot of new changes that are built into Starship version 3, from the tip to the tail, from the design of the heat shield, the inner stage, the engines.
Mhm.
We can dig into the particulars in a minute, but just coming into this mission now, 7+ months after the last time we saw Block 2 of Starship fly, how are you feeling about how this mission will go? Weather put to the side.
Yeah, I mean, I'm following along like everybody else, and we'll get some more. We'll start to get some answers, I think, in the next hour or so. But I think, like it's been 3 years, right, since SpaceX started the integrated flight test of Starship. There's been a lot of advancements, right? And there's been some setbacks along the way. The ground test explosion at Massey's last year, the booster rupture towards the end of 2025, the explosions at the very start of 2025 in flight, which caused commercial airline traffic to have to move and scramble to adjust. So I guess one question, or I think we're all going to be looking to see how SpaceX locks in what the lessons, right, that they've learned over the past like 3 years in this kind of intense run of flight tests. I mean, to me, like the new pad performance, how that works, and like what the Raptors, these upgraded engines, offer, are going to be just a couple of the real like fascinating things to watch for sure.
Yeah, and they're mentioning of tying in the propulsion and the avionics system for the ship upper stage.
Yeah.
Does that solve some of the aft end of ship issues that you were just talking about that we saw during Flight 7 and Flight 8, and the harmonic issue that caused the ultimate decision to break up that vehicle? It seems like they fixed that with Block 2, and do those lessons carry over to Block 3? Well, I guess see in just about an hour and 11 minutes time if they're able to get off the ground today, which we saw a full, it would appear to be a full wet dress rehearsal back on May 11th, that Monday, but then they destacked the rocket. They took the ship over to the Massey's test site and did some more testing back there, brought it back out to Pad 2, and then did a partial wet dress yesterday. So it's a little unclear if they're still working through some things, or if they're, really in a good spot to get this rocket in flight today. It's hard to say at this point.
I think it's this mission, this test flight happening a day after we get an incredible amount of news about the company, its performance, its plans for the future, is really interesting. A lot of eyes on it. A lot of eyes are on this. From certainly investors are tuning in, because now they're also trying to, and not that they weren't before, but like there's, I think, more investors, more attention on this mission, just given that the IPO is in motion. We did a story about the flight today, and I spoke with one investor who said, look, this is hard stuff to get right. SpaceX has a strong execution record, and Starship, when it gets really going, I'm sort of paraphrasing, will unlock a lot of value. But that's the test today, and that's what's before the company with this one, for sure. I mean, I'm sure you did see, Will, that like SpaceX did sort of have news in the S1 about its expectations for starting operational flights, for those V3 Starlink satellites in the second half of this year. So clearly there's some expectation that, Starship is close or closer to sort of starting those more operational missions and moving past the kind of intense, test phase of this program. But we'll
Yeah,
see. Yeah.
I think it was back in September of last year where Bill Gerstenmaier was speaking at the Glenn Symposium up in Ohio and said that, after the first flight of version 3 of Starship, depending on how it goes, Flight 13 or the next one would potentially be an orbital test flight. So this could go very quickly from a suborbital test to an orbital flight to maybe Flight 14 being the one that actually deploys Starlink satellites. I would imagine that they'd want to have at least one orbital demonstration before they try to deploy satellites into orbit. But, SpaceX moves fast and, is really gung-ho about trying things. So,
Yeah.
Potentially 13 could be the charm as far as seeing Starship or Starlink V3 go on orbit. But I want to go back to something you said a second ago, Micah, about
Sure.
the timing of the S1 and where this launch lines up. It seemed like at one point that this launch could have happened last week, and they just needed more time for testing.
Yeah.
Should we you follow the business world a lot closer than I do, so should we read anything into the publication of the S1 being so close to this launch happening, or is it completely just happenstance?
The honest answer is, it's a good question, Will, but the honest answer is I don't know. It would be just sort of speculative to guess. I mean, SpaceX has been tracking to do this IPO for some time. They sort of accelerated their plans earlier this month, and putting aside all of the details about the financials, about the operations, about the future, the one thing that the publication of this document, right, does is it really just sets in motion officially the IPO. And from what we understand is the company would start selling its shares to the public in mid-June. So I agree with you, though. It's like a few days ago, we were talking about a potential Flight 12 on Friday, the 15th, if I'm remembering correctly. And of
Yeah.
course, that's moved around. So I don't want to speculate, but it may just be happenstance, but I really don't know. Yeah.
And so for those that have never, watched a public or a company being taken public, so now that
Yeah.
we've got the S1 document, can you give those of us who are maybe less business track minded an idea of, what happens between publication yesterday and the actual IPO on the 12th, as you and your colleagues have reported?
Well, so basically what happens now is the company, its advisors, bankers, and investors are going to be in this, they're going to have this kind of big conversation, a lot of meetings to try to figure out what SpaceX, how to value SpaceX, right? We don't know what the valuation, the worth of the total company is yet. Um, that's part of the kind of process to discover what that price is, if that makes sense. That's kind of what happens next. We have reported that SpaceX could be valued at least $1.5 trillion. That is, would classify it in the kind of small group of companies, big technology companies that are past $1 trillion in value.
Those are
And
called like
then
unicorns, right?
well, I think a unicorn is just has a valuation of 1 billion. I mean, trillion is
Okay.
a totally different category, like Nvidia, Apple. Just a very small number. But the other thing, just to kind of simplify it too, it's like, what is SpaceX doing here? They're selling shares. They're going to raise money. That's a huge part of the right. That's the point of an IPO, is to raise funding to allow some investors to sell their shares, but also to allow the company to put more funds in their account to pay for all the work that's ahead of them. And that's that's what SpaceX is tracking to now. There's a lot of work ahead on Starship, on the satellite program, on Starlink, AI satellites, and other parts of the kind of AI program, that they've laid out.
Maybe a too much of a crystal ball type question to pose, but do you think that, knock on wood, but if the launch were to go less than favorably, I'll phrase it like that today, that, some prospective investors who are maybe a little newer to the space game and just kind of looking at this landscape, and they've certainly heard the name SpaceX if they're looking at potentially investing in space, might get,
Yeah.
spooked or, a little bit unsettled if they don't know enough about what a, rapid unscheduled disassembly in SpaceX speak would mean.
I think it's a great question. And one of the things that having a stock that
Oh,
trades
actually,
public. Oh,
Micah, let me interrupt you. I'm
sure.
so sorry.
Yep.
We do have a new T0 here. We're just adjusting our clock here. SpaceX says they're now targeting 6 p.m. Central Time for the launch. That would be 7 p.m. Eastern or 2300 UTC. So, as I mentioned at the very top of the broadcast, they have a 90-minute window for today. And so they're eating up the first 30 minutes of that. Unclear
Yeah.
if that's because of weather in the area that they're hoping to skirt past a little, or if they're troubleshooting something. SpaceX has not specified. They've just noted the new time. Worth noting, sort of in context of all this, they were loading trucks of propellant down at the propellant farm pretty late in the afternoon, given where they were looking to launch at the opening of the window. So not to say with certainty that that dot is connected to this dot of the time change, but just putting out the information there as we know it. So all that context being given. Micah, sorry for interrupting, but
No,
please
no,
go.
yeah, I just noticed that too. Where were we? We were talking about, how do investors react during an explosion or an anomaly? I mean, one of the things that's kind of fascinating when you're a publicly traded rocket launcher, if something goes wrong, we've seen the stock react instantly and go down. I mean, that happened with Firefly and when one of their anomalies with Alpha. And it's obviously not going to happen. Like there's no stock, right, to sort of move up or down based on whatever happens today. But I think that'll be, a question for investors going forward. Should SpaceX shares start to trade as we're expecting, how do they metabolize the moments, where things potentially go wrong? And, as you know, Will, and a lot of your listeners and viewers know, um, you know, space is hard. That's what they
It's
say.
an
And,
expression for a reason. Yeah.
yeah, I've heard that a few times. And so I think that's something that we'll be watching really closely in the future. Um, um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to that. No, that's a very salient point. We've got a little bit of apples to apples with the situation, both with Firefly, with both the in-flight issue with Alpha, as well as their anomaly that they had during testing out at their rocket ranch outside of Austin, Texas. That happened last year, and now they've gotten back to the pad and they're moving to a Block 2, but even when it's not the fault of the company that is publicly traded, I think of AST Space Mobile, for example, that, they could have their payload heading to space, but there could be an anomaly with their ticket to ride. In that case, it was a Blue Origin upper stage issue that prevented that from getting into low Earth orbit. So I think, there's a lot of information that I think investors can take away from where we are in the moment and when SpaceX is potentially, putting their stock available for investors, is that people have been able to see some of these examples, and so maybe it won't be as foreign of a concept of seeing space being hard. And like you said, going back to the S1, they were very explicit in couching in their, list of reasons of what could go wrong with the company and be potential setbacks. In a variety of ways, they essentially said space is hard. Schedules move, timelines for launches change, and for this, that, or the other, that may push things back. So sort of laying the table is like why you shouldn't be skittish.
And well, and I also, I mean, it's
also this is not financial advice, just to be very explicit.
Fair enough. No, and to be sure, SpaceX has investors now. They have many investors right now as a privately held company. It's just when you have a publicly traded stock, right? It can move around like in real time and that's part of like what the stock indicates is like what investors are sort of feeling at any given or thinking or analyzing about a company at any given time. So what that'll look like for SpaceX, I think is still to be determined, because they have a very unique place sort of in the launch landscape and in the space kind of industry, just given their growth and their tech and kind of operational cadence over the last few years.
Maybe to pause and pivot in the last few minutes that we've got you here, Micah. As I mentioned earlier, as we were bringing you into the broadcast, coming up in just a few days, we're going to be hearing from NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman and from his Associate Administrator Amit Kshatriya, and believe Dr. Lori Glaze, as well as potentially some others, about the status of the moon base. And this will be really kind of our first big post-Artemis 2 NASA update on where things stand. I mean, we saw the core stage for Artemis 3 arrive here at the Kennedy Space Center. That was back in mid-April. And, since then, things have been kind of quiet from the outside of, NASA looking in. So, not asking you to predict exactly what's going to be said, but maybe phrase a different way. What are you hoping that we hear on Tuesday?
Well, I got to tell you, Will, as a reporter, I try not to hope, for anything, but we'll see what comes. I think, as you noted, like NASA had just a ton of news, right, to start this year. Of course, topping the charts there was the Artemis 2 mission and all the moments that we saw with that flight. But then just sort of Administrator Isaacman's sort of starting to implement or lay out his agenda and try to implement it across the agency. There's a lot of details to sort of be ironed out, right? And all and a lot of these sort of new initiatives that he's sort of put on the table, from the future of space stations in low Earth orbit to the moon base. I'm eager to learn more details and sort of get as far down into the nitty gritty about contracts, cadence, milestones, and timelines, in the next week and kind of in the weeks ahead for sure.
Yeah, and we saw a little bit about at least one of the lunar train vehicles plans to pivot from what they had before, Lunar Outpost, with their now new Pegasus LTV. So I am personally curious if any of that side of the moon base is going to be colored in a little bit more during this event on Tuesday.
Yeah.
Just looking at the time here, I think we're unfortunately just about out of time with you, Mike. I want to be respectful of your afternoon. But I guess just in wrapping here in our conversation, is there anything in particular, of the litany of things that SpaceX is hoping to demonstrate with Flight 12 here today? What are you most watching to see if it goes well, or how it performs?
Yeah. I mean, I think a broader question I'm thinking about is how all the lessons, right, from flights 1 through 11 sort of get locked into this vehicle and locked into this mission. There's a lot of new changes. The SpaceX executives and leaders have described this as a new vehicle. And new vehicles historically have challenges on their first flights. So I just really want to see how the kind of lessons learned locks in, or it potentially doesn't here, and what that means for sort of a new vehicle, even though there's a lot of heritage here, clearly, just given all the work that's been done over the last 3 years. So I don't know if that makes sense, but
Yeah, just
that's
seeing if
kind of broadly how I'm kind of thinking about it.
Yeah, they've kind of created a recipe for Starship now, and we'll see how well that bakes into version 3. If you'll
Yeah.
pardon the food analogy, it's getting close to the dinner hour here, so
I
maybe
hear
my
you.
my mind is wandering a little bit. But Micah Maidenberg, reporter with the Wall Street Journal, thank you so much for joining us for our coverage here today. Really
Yeah.
appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thank you, Will. It's been a lot of fun, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. And of course, as we mentioned earlier, if you want to follow Micah's work, you can find a few of his articles down in the description box of this live stream to peruse a little bit. And there you can find hyperlinks to his socials as well. So, taking a look at the clock here, we're currently T minus 1 hour, 23 minutes, 33 seconds and counting. The planned liftoff of Starship Flight 12. And again, our thanks to Micah Maidenberg of the Wall Street Journal for joining us for our coverage of Starship Flight 12. Really appreciate him and the team for their reporting and for lending him to us for part of the afternoon here. If you are just joining us, take a look at the clock. SpaceX did adjust the T0 for the liftoff of Starship Flight 12. Now looking at that departure time at 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern, 2300 UTC. The 90-minute window opened up about, or at 5:30 p.m. Central. So they still have some time to play with here, which is good news if needed. Taking a look at our live chat here, I want to thank the more than 8,400 of you who are watching along with us live now today. If you haven't already, you could do us a big favor just by clicking that like button and sharing the stream to allow some more folks to find their way into this live launch coverage here tonight. For those who are just hopping into the live chat here, want to make a quick note about our live chat rules just to help the mods out. If you could refrain from delving into politics or religion, we'd greatly appreciate that. Also, don't type your message in all caps, and we'd ask that you post your message in English so that the mods can respond as needed. Emojis are perfectly fine, just don't post a huge block of them. And last but certainly not least, we would ask that you treat each other with the kindness and respect that you yourself would like to be treated. And our thanks to moderators Jeff Hansen, Jules, and M. Teresa for helping us out in the live chat space. Also want to thank Cumulus Granatus, who's helping to answer folks' questions in the chat. And a big thanks, as always, to our wonderful channel members here on YouTube who help make this and every other live launch coverage possible. Channel membership comes with a number of perks, including discounts at our online shop, which is shop.spaceflightnow.com, access to member-only videos here on YouTube, and access to our members-only Discord server. I want to thank some of our channel members here on YouTube. Give a shout out to folks like Marco Gennari. Oh gosh, now my chat is frozen. Apologies, folks. Time now is currently T minus 1 hour, 11 minutes, 23 seconds and counting. As we're getting closer to the point at which SpaceX should start the process of actually flowing propellant on board its Starship rocket, let's go ahead and take a moment to talk about the countdown timeline for the mission, let you know what's coming down the pipeline, both literally and figuratively, for SpaceX today. Things will get going at T minus 50 minutes is when the SpaceX launch director will verify that they're go for the start of prop load. Fueling will get underway here just a little bit earlier than your typical Falcon 9 rocket, where that tanking process starts at T-minus 35 minutes. Here for a Starship rocket, it begins at T-minus 38 minutes and 53 seconds with the loading of liquid oxygen on board the ship upper stage. SpaceX will actually start with the locks on both ship and the Super Heavy booster before they start to load the liquid methane on either side. And the booster fuel, as you can see on the screen, begins at T-minus 34 minutes, 43 seconds, with ship fuel load beginning. Actually, that's a little bit of a typo there. My apologies. Let me get the correct record here. Ship fuel load actually begins at T-minus 32 minutes, 59 seconds. See if we're good from here. Yep. So the Raptor chill down, which is when SpaceX will flow a small amount of liquid oxygen through the Raptor turbo pumps, both on the 33 engines on the booster and the 6 engines on the ship upper stage. That happens at T-minus 21 minutes, 30 seconds. And then in the final minutes of the count, booster prop load will wrap up just under the 3-minute mark, and then about 40 seconds later, ship prop load will also conclude. Finally, within the last minute, as has previously been the case, SpaceX will have an opportunity to hold the count. We presume that that has not changed. That comes up at T-minus 40 seconds. And then if there are any issues, they can hold there for several minutes at least in order to troubleshoot and then let the clock proceed from that T-minus 40 second mark. We did see, though, at one point during, I believe it was a static fire test of the Super Heavy booster, where the water deluge system kicked on, stopped, and they were able to replenish it and keep moving forward. Previously, that was not a capability that we saw that they could do over at Pad 1, but at Pad 2, they are apparently able to replenish the water deluge system, the sound suppression system, in order to continue and proceed. So the activation of that should not be a showstopper potentially today. Anyway, continuing to the countdown, the point at T-minus 30 seconds is when the SpaceX launch director will verify that they are in fact go for launch. The flame deflector that I was just talking about, or the water deluge system, will kick on about 17 seconds before liftoff. So dumping a lot of water onto the pad. Obviously, there's a lot of energy coming out of the bottom of the Super Heavy rocket that they want to protect against. The engine startup will be issued at T-minus 3 seconds. And one of the changes to the Super Heavy booster as compared to previous iterations is that this version has a larger fuel transfer line, which is about the diameter and size of a Falcon 9 rocket. So they're able to do the engine startup all at once instead of a staggered engine startup that we saw previously. And then, of course, at T0 is when liftoff is expected to occur if all proceeds as planned. Time now, T-minus 1 hour, 6 minutes, 48 seconds and counting. For those of you who were not with us earlier in the broadcast, we were talking a little bit about the importance and implication for the Starship rocket as it relates to NASA's Artemis program, given that this rocket is one of the 2 vehicles that's part of the Human Landing System, or the HLS program, managed by Marshall Space Flight Center up in Huntsville, Alabama, the Rocket City. Prior to the launch of Artemis 2, we had the opportunity to talk with a couple of folks connected to the HLS program. We heard earlier from Dr. Ken Shinaki, and now I want to introduce you to Tom Percy, also with HLS, one of their engineers there. And so here is the conversation that we had in the lead up to the Artemis 2 launch. Actually, before we go ahead and bring in the interview with Tom Percy, I want to note that we do have yet another new T0 from SpaceX. Team's now targeting a liftoff of the Starship rocket at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. That is 6:30 p.m. Central, or 23:30 UTC for those joining around the world. So SpaceX now depleting a full hour out of their total 90-minute launch opportunity today. We'll see if they continue to push into the final 30 minutes, but as you can see, our countdown clock has been reset. Currently standing at T-minus 1 hour, 34 minutes, 44 seconds, and counting. Alrighty, we've got that interview ready for you. This is our conversation with the HLS program's Tom Percy. Tom Percy, thank you so much for joining us from the Human Landing System Department.
Absolutely.
I want to just start there. For folks who don't know, the HLS program based up in the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, the Rocket City.
Yep.
How long have you been with HLS, and how did you find yourself in this particular program?
Well, so I've actually been on HLS since before it was a program. I was on the team that did the pre-formulation work for the lander program. It eventually turned into HLS, and I transitioned over to the program when that happened. So I've been on it since the beginning.
And so you've seen all of the evolutions of
Yes.
the vehicles, the concepts, the competition.
Yep.
You know, what's it been like all these years, now at this point where we're, on the cusp of seeing one, if not both of those in early stages, flying meet up with Orion next year?
It's really, really exciting. You look back to where we started to where we are today. It's a pretty phenomenal pace, and the team's been doing a great job, and we're really, really excited for the opportunity to demonstrate some of the capabilities in the new 2027 mission. So.
And it sounds like from your colleague Ken Shinaki that you're waiting to hear back from the providers on some of the finer points of their profiles for Artemis 3. So in that in-between pocket, what's kind of the focus for you?
So for us, our main focus right now is trying to figure out exactly what we want our test objectives to be for that mission. We're doing that in conjunction with our providers. They have things that they want to demonstrate. We have things that we believe would buy down risk for future missions if we were able to demonstrate them in Earth orbit. So we're focused on outlining what we think the right test objectives might be, laying out some of the top level mission design work, and then working with the providers to layer in the next level of detail.
And of course, the original Artemis 3 was always going to dock with Starship. Now you've got Blue Origin potentially in the mix. So as you're setting that groundwork for, the HLS test objectives and seeing how they sync up, what are the maybe top 2 or 3 things, in addition, I imagine, to the docking sequence itself, but what are you hoping to tick off on your checklists?
I think the big thing for us is the rendezvous and docking sequence. We have the proximity operations demo that's going to be done on this mission in Artemis 2. We're going to build on that and hope to demonstrate the proximity operations and docking that's going to be both mission critical and crew critical for the landing missions. To be able to rendezvous Orion with our landers, bring that crew home, is going to be critical. And so we want to demonstrate that as part of this mission.
And in working with the interior of these spacecraft in conjunction with the astronaut office, can you talk about what some of the things are that, as you've gotten feedback from the astronauts of wanting to refine things, maybe make it a little bit more easily reachable from one seated position, how much the crew cabins have changed from sort of original concept to kind of where they're sitting now?
Well, I think it's an interesting evolution for both providers. There's been a lot of change. You kind of expect that with any preliminary design. As the design matures, you want to improve things here and there. I think one of the great milestones that we've got coming up for both providers are physical crew cabin mock-ups that the crews will be able to work in and do human-in-the-loop testing. Work on some of the usability of the cabin, the layout of the cabin, displays, and those sorts of things. So we have cabin 1 being built by SpaceX down at Starbase, and we have a medium fidelity mock-up installed at JSC for Blue Origin, and we're able to do human-in-the-loop demonstrations and testing with both of those.
And at what point do you need to see that shift from a medium to a high fidelity mock-up?
It'll happen over the coming year or so. I think that as we get closer to the critical design reviews and kind of potting the full up design and get into final fabrication, we really want those things nailed down. But there's also going to be some flexibility as things progress, to be able to move things and update things as necessary.
And one of the ways, of course, that this reimagined Artemis 3 buys down risk is it doesn't require the propellant transfer that both are eventually going to need in this mission. How are you feeling about this new sort of stepping stone, adding in an Apollo 9 style mission to the mix?
I think we're really excited about it, actually. I found myself personally very energized after the announcement about the Artemis 3. I think that it's a great opportunity to buy down risk incrementally. It's something that we've thought about a lot, and I think this is a great opportunity to go demonstrate some of those critical systems while we're a little closer to home, and allow us to kind of balance out the crew risk with the reward, learn some things, and help ourselves progress more towards those landing missions.
And the next couple of months are going to be really dynamic for the HLS partners. Obviously, we've got the next flight of Starship, the first version 3 that's about to fly. Blue Moon Mark 1 is about to head off to the moon South Pole. As you're seeing these precursor versions of what will ultimately be the template in a way for HLS, what are you watching for specifically with some of these stepping stone launches from the providers?
Well, I think it's different for each, but the main thing is where we share common systems, or where the data that we're going to gather on these flights has direct relevancy to the systems that we're going to fly on our missions. We really want to see that data. We want to understand it. I think for someone like SpaceX, as they're progressing through their V3s and on to the orbital missions and their prop transfer demos, prop transfer efficiency, boil off rates are going to be pretty critical, so we'll want to understand those. For Blue Moon, the Mark 1 landing is going to be really exciting for everybody. It's not really our program, it's Eclipse program, but they're going to fly a lot of the same systems that we're going to have on our Mark 2. So we're relying on the same kind of cryogenic propellants. We're both going to fly the BE7 engine. And so we're really looking forward to getting some data on the performance of the engine and the cryo systems that make up the main propulsion for that landing.
And like I mentioned a little bit ago, the prop transfer element is something that both will use in a slightly different configuration. Where do you see, maybe if we can give us sort of a percentage of where we are now versus where we need to be, how close are we to actualizing that technology, would you say?
I think percentage is really hard to quantify.
Fair.
I think that there's a lot of progress being made with both providers in their own unique situations. That first prop transfer flight is going to be really important to us for SpaceX, and we expect to see that and get some real great data from it. I think more importantly for me, just as a long-term vision for space exploration, we know that multi-launch architectures for deep space exploration are going to have to become a common thing. And so all the things that both providers are doing to manage the development and the understanding of how to coordinate multiple launches to be able to build these bigger exploration systems is going to help us not only for the moon, but also for Mars and beyond. And it's just a really, really exciting time in that technical area in particular. We've spent a lot of time trying to make progress on those things, and I think we're finally seeing it in some of our providers.
Just last question, because I realize we're at the limit of your time, unfortunately. I think people see the big things with SpaceX, the big things with Blue, but they may miss the HLS program in the background running between the two. What do you want folks to know about what the HLS program is and provides that they may not be thinking about when they just see the flashy things?
It's a great question. I think that we bring a lot of subject matter expertise across a wide range of technical areas. The agency's got a long history of human spaceflight. We make that subject matter expertise available to both providers, both through our collaboration agreements, also with our government test agreements, where we can make facilities available for them to use for testing, and then through our insight, just the general knowledge gathering of our insight team, so that when it comes time for us to perform that certification role, we're able to confidently stand up and say that these landers are safe and ready to fly our crews to the moon. I think we bring a lot of that to the table. And then just in general integration, my office in particular, I'm the systems engineering and integration manager.
Mm-hmm.
We spend a lot of time managing our integration with Orion, with the suits program, with the agency at large. And I think that pays off dividends for all of our providers and just the total mission success.
Well, love to talk to you for another hour, but we'll save that for another day.
Absolutely.
Tom Percy, thank you so much with the
you.
Human Landing System program.
Appreciate it.
And again, our thanks to Tom Percy with the Human Landing System program based at the Marshall Space Flight Center for the time and the lead up to the Artemis 2 mission back in late March was when we had that conversation. Time currently T-minus 1 hour, 24 minutes, 28 seconds and counting. For those who are just popping in, as a reminder, SpaceX has readjusted the T0, now currently targeting departure of Starship at 6:30 p.m. Central. That is 7:30 p.m. Eastern, or 23:30 UTC for those joining around the world. Starting to look like a beautiful sunset down there in southern Texas, and we are thankfully joined by another guest here right now who is also in Texas, but a little bit further north of the pad, Mr. Stephen Clark, space reporter at Ars Technica, a very familiar face around these parts here at Spaceflight Now. Stephen, how are you doing, my friend?
Great to be with you, Will. How are you?
Doing good. Just waiting to see if things will cooperate today for a launch, as you are also eagerly wondering and waiting, and we'll see how things eventually shake out. But it's as we were talking with Micah earlier, it's a big day for SpaceX just to get to this point of making a run at launching V3.
Yeah, this new version of Starship will unlock a lot of new capability for SpaceX, whether it's their internal goals of Starlink, the next version of Starlink mobile version 2 as well, and as well as some of the orbital data center type applications they've talked about. And for NASA, it's very important to lay the groundwork for in-orbit refueling, which of course is a prerequisite for a flight to the moon for Starship for the Artemis program. And also fundamental to both of those goals is actually being able to recover and reuse Starship. And this version of the ship will be capable of that. Of course, we won't see that today, but I think if today's flight goes perfectly or near perfectly, we should see that soon, at least an attempt to catch Starship, as we've seen with the booster in the past.
Yeah, and the last time we talked on mic was I believe in the midst of the Artemis 2 mission. Trying to remember if that was for the lunar flyby or for splashdown. It was a whirlwind of 10 days.
The flyby, yes.
It was the flyby, yeah. So lots happened since the 4 astronauts returned from their flyby around the moon, becoming the humans who traveled furthest from Earth, and came back and have been very much telling the tale around the country, and headed up to Canada a little bit, and now have come back here. Want to start actually where I ended with Micah, which was to talk about the event that's coming up this coming Tuesday, during which the NASA administrator is going to be giving a talk about sort of where things are right now with the moon base. Obviously, not too many details are known about what exactly is going to unfold during that conversation, but I guess what are you hoping might be addressed, or kind of will be listening for, especially?
Yeah, so I think there are a few questions that need to be resolved in terms of the moon base. One of them is power. There's an effort within NASA that needs to be accelerated now, or greatly expanded, for fission surface power, for nuclear power on the lunar surface. Another one would be mobility, the lunar terrain vehicle potentially. An update on that would be really nice to give the astronauts some mobility on the surface. Of course, those types of systems come after landing on the moon. So just some general updates on the update says it's going to be on the moon base, but and some, they have to start planning for that. But, we have a lot of questions about HLS and Blue Origin, the Blue Moon, and Starship. Of course, today's flight may inform a lot of what they can say about Starship next week. So some of that will hinge on what happens in the next 90 minutes to a couple hours from now.
Yeah, and I suppose one thing that probably won't come out of Tuesday, if I had to guess, is we probably won't hear the names of the Artemis 3 astronauts who are going to be flying, given that you'd think that announcement would come down at the Johnson Space Center and not at NASA headquarters in DC. Probably, but that's just sort of a best guess based on location.
I suspect you're right, and also I think that would probably be a standalone announcement as well, and really has relatively little to do with the moon base itself, of course, for Artemis 3 in Earth orbit.
Yeah, now that we're on the divergent timeline where Artemis 3 has nothing, well, not nothing to do, that's a little bit reductive, but doesn't directly involve a landing on the moon, I'll phrase it like that, but certainly, involves both of the landers from Blue and from SpaceX. Obviously, we're going to learn a lot today about the Starship performance and the timeline, and I'm hoping that SpaceX here will have a little bit more detail on the prop transfer. But before we get sort of down the road of what may happen in the future, let's talk about the present. Of course, there's a lot to delve into with the changes that have happened since we last saw Starship fly in the finale of Block 2. Let's start with the engines. Starting from the bottom, working our way up the launch vehicle. Of course, you've got Raptor 3s on both the Super Heavy booster and the ship upper stage. So, we've seen some testing, some static fires. What's been your impression of this new iteration of Raptor engines so far?
Well, they certainly have a more clean, sleek look than the previous iterations of the Raptor. It looks more like a grown-up rocket, so to speak, than the earlier versions of Starship and Super Heavy and the Raptor engine itself. A couple of innovations, I think. They're supposed to be more reliable. We'll learn more about that today, perhaps with this flight. And also, they're lighter than the previous engines, so there's some mass savings, which is part of what translates to the higher performance and lift capability of Starship version 3. Higher thrust is the other part of that equation, and they're also more self-contained. There's no, there are fewer exposed parts that could be damaged. There are the previous versions of the booster had sort of panels, or each engine was kind of cocooned in its own little self-contained pod to prevent an engine failure from cascading to an adjacent engine. That's no longer necessary with Starship or Raptor version 3, according to SpaceX. These engines are designed to be able to contain a failure within itself without damaging an adjacent engine. So, of course, we've seen Starship. Well, not Starship, but Super Heavy complete a entirely successful launch sequence with engine failure before. So even if that happens today, maybe that would not doom the flight, but it could tell us a little bit about maybe some more work that SpaceX needs to do with the Raptor 3. But the Raptor 3, how long ago was that announced now? We first saw the picture of that Raptor 3 on social media, 2 or 3 years ago? If I recall.
That was in the summer of 2024.
So, a couple of years ago, and a lot of people back then, a lot of critics of SpaceX were, like that engine is not flight ready. They has had to go through more testing, but the engine that's flying today looks a lot like the one we saw 2 years ago from the outside, at least.
Yeah, pretty darn similar. I think in our sort of table setter video that we published here on the channel, the amount of thrust that the engine is capable of now as of the update that came mid-month is about roughly 30 tons of force, less than what was originally advertised back in 2024. So maybe they've kind of dialed that in a little bit, gotten a little bit more realistic with what this version of Raptor 3 can do. But of course, it's like SpaceX does routinely, they'll continue to iterate. I mean, the version of Raptor that's flying here, even though there won't necessarily be another big block upgrade by the end of this year, they'll more than likely go in and tinker with some things in between flights and continue to work to ratchet up the performance.
And each engine is about a ton lighter, if my memory serves right, about a ton lighter than each Raptor 2. So that alone saves more than 30 tons on the booster.
Yeah, just looking at the numbers here, the Raptor 2 sea level version was 1,525 kilograms, or the Raptor 3 is now 1,525 kilograms. Raptor 2 was just a little more than 1,600, so quite a nice bit of mass saving there. And then you multiply that by 33, of course. Definitely helps when SpaceX is trying to get 100 tons to orbit. Taking a look at the time here, T-minus 1 hour, 14 minutes, 24 seconds as things currently stand. Of course, SpaceX does still have about 30 minutes left to maneuver within their allotted 90-minute launch window, so things could change again. If SpaceX is unable to launch today, they have not said if they do have an opportunity to launch tomorrow or if they would need to take more time to reload the propellant farm. It sort of depends on how far they get into the count today. If they were to stand down before prop load begins, that would obviously seemingly put them in a better position, depending on the reason for potential scrub. If they do start fueling and would need to replenish the tank farm, that would get them into a slightly different scenario. And of course, we're knocking on the door of Memorial Day weekend here in the United States. So one of the nice things about Starbase for passersby is you can travel on down there and see it for yourself by riding down State Road 4, as you and I, Stephen, have. And you can get pretty darn close to the rocket. They've kind of curtailed that a little bit from what we've seen from folks that are down there at the moment. But, it's a far more accessible launch site than, say, Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, or certainly here at the Cape. But as my colleague Stephen Young is reminding me in my ear, the weather outlook for tomorrow is, as an 8-ball would say, not so good. So, if they are unable to launch today, tomorrow may just be off the table because of weather conditions. So with the holiday factored in, potentially we may be looking at a delay till Tuesday. Again, that's only if SpaceX is unable to launch today, which is very much not set in stone. Just want to give folks a sense of where things might go in these next in the next little bit here, as we're about an hour, 12 and a half minutes to the planned launch of this vehicle. Stephen Clark, bringing you back in here as we're talking about some of the updates to the rocket. Let's keep going. We talked about the engines a little bit. The Super Heavy boosters got some nice aesthetic changes, both to the hardware externally, internally. I mean, for folks that are just sort of casual viewers of Starship, you may have clocked that there are now just 3 grid fins on the rocket instead of the 4 that were previously flown. There's a new integrated hot stage, or integrated inner stage replacing the hot stage ring. Having taken the time to really look through what has changed from the last time we saw a Super Heavy fly, which was the reflown B-15. What's kind of been your takeaway about what's different this go around?
Yeah, well, I think one thing is, and we don't really have a great view of the internals of the booster in terms of imagery, other than one thing which I'll mention in a moment, is redesigned propulsion system. The feed lines heading to the Raptor engines, those have changed, is my understanding. And the one thing I'll mention is we did see a picture that was really interesting for your viewers who watch a lot of Falcon 9 launches, is the fuel feed line, the downcomer, the transfer tube. A lot of people call it different things, but it's the pipe that brings the fuel from the top of the booster down to the engine section. That in and of itself, on this version of Super Heavy is roughly the same size as a Falcon 9 rocket. So more than 20 stories tall, about 12, 13 feet in diameter, which is that's just the pipe in the middle of the rocket that brings the fuel down to the engines. And of course, the entire booster is roughly 30 feet in diameter. So that's more than double, 2.5 times roughly the diameter of a Falcon 9 rocket. So the scale is immense, and bringing all of that fuel down from the methane tank to the engine section, that's a lot of fuel flow that goes through that piece of hardware to get to those 33 engines, each producing more than 500,000 pounds of thrust, or roughly 500,000 pounds of thrust. You mentioned the grid fins. That's a really unique look. It looks like one's missing if you're familiar with seeing the grid fins on Falcon 9 or the previous versions of the Super Heavy. And then, of course, you mentioned the hot stage ring. That's the one piece on top of the booster, which was jettisoned on each of the previous Starship test flights and not recovered. It fell into the ocean, and it will stay attached to the booster now. So that's one more piece of hardware that can be recovered and reused in the future. Of course, today's flight, the booster will not be recovered intact.
Yeah, just worth emphasizing that this is a fully suborbital flight. It's going to feel, or it's going to look fairly similar to Starship Flight 11, in which we will not see a ship catch attempt or an attempt to return the Super Heavy booster to the launch tower there. I do want to just go back to what you were saying a second ago, Stephen. We've got a photo now of that fuel transfer tube for the liquid methane, which will allow for simultaneous startup of all 3 Raptor engines, which is a big change from what we've seen with previous flights.
Yeah, that's an impressive piece of hardware there for sure. I mean, imagine a Falcon 9 sitting on the pad, and that's the size of that transfer tube. So, and you can see it as it goes into the top of the vehicle down toward the bottom, how much wider the actual booster is than, for example, the Falcon 9. A good side-by-side comparison of 2 different SpaceX rockets.
Yeah, and astonishing the infrastructure changes that they made to Pad 2 allow the fueling timeline for Starship to be almost identical to a Falcon 9 at this point. I mean, it's off by roughly 4 minutes, which is pretty incredible considering that a Super Heavy booster and a Starship upper stage have combined about 11 million pounds of propellant compared to about 1 million for a Falcon 9.
Yeah, that's impressive. So that should begin around 39 minutes before launch, and the load should be complete around 2 minutes before launch. So in less than 40 minutes, about 37 minutes, that 11 million pounds of propellant will be pumped into the rocket. That's really impressive. And the Falcon 9 takes about the same time, a little less than 35 minutes.
And, for folks that were not with us for the part of our broadcast where we're talking with Micah about the prelude to SpaceX going public with their company, with the initial public offering set for potentially June 12th. Stephen, want to get your thoughts on, quite a bit of news that was, baked into that document. One of the key takeaways, of course, was just how much of a prominent factor Starship plays into all of the various ventures that SpaceX wants to have be successful. It lays into the XAI side. It certainly factors into what they want to do with connectivity, both with broadband, with the classic Starlinks, with the direct-to-cell. What were some of your big takeaways? Let's start sort of high level with the S1 document that we saw yesterday.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of these financial documents that we see filings with SEC have a lot of boilerplate risk statements. If this happens, there are risks to our business, things like that. And throughout the document, it really made clear that anything that happens with Starship is going to have knock-on effects on Starlink, on their launch services, and of course XAI and the orbital data center program that they're starting up. Starship is fundamental to all of that, and any delays is in the Starship program or any setbacks is going to have second order, third order effects on all those other programs. And the other thing I think that stood out was, they have really, really ambitious, probably under sells it, but really, really bold, lofty goals for XAI. I think $28 trillion total addressable market, vastly exceeds anything they can do, even with Starlink, and launch services is a distant third in terms of the three business areas that they laid out. We'll see if that pans out. I think the AI market, I think, is certainly outclasses launch services and Starlink. 28 trillion or not the question for me to answer. But let's keep it to space here. That's my expertise. So the other thing I think that stood out was how much money SpaceX is spending on Starship development. So about $3 billion last year on Starship research and development. In the first quarter of this year, just shy of $1 billion. So if you you can extrapolate that and see that SpaceX has likely spent somewhere between 10 and $20 billion on Starship over the last decade. We don't know the exact number, but
I think they referenced 15 billion.
15 billion.
Development.
So that's and there's a lot more to do with Starship. They have more launch pads to build. They have a second factory that they're building, of course, in Florida. They have, it's really unclear what exactly they will have to do to reuse the ship and booster, how much infrastructure they'll need to store the vehicles between flights if they're storing them between flights. And then, of course, HLS and human rating and all that stuff, those numbers presumably are not baked into that $15 billion figure. So that cost is going to grow.
Yeah, certainly. And, there will definitely be more iterations to come. And, once they see really how the performance of Pad 2 does as well. I mean, that's a big factor in how they build out not only Launch Complex 39A and the tower that is going to continue to mature there, but we've started to see with some of the, actually courtesy of the administrator of those excellence flyover rewards that have been conducted with his private planes. Some photos have been shared on NASA's pages, and you can see, looking in the background of some of those shots, some bits and pieces of Space Launch Complex 37, and you're starting to see the development out at that site, which will have a couple of Starship towers out that way as well. So a lot that SpaceX is going to learn from here. And thank you to Stephen Young in the background for bringing up. This is a live view of LC-39A. You can see the Starship tower prominently there in between the crew access tower there on the left-hand side, now devoid of its crew access arm, of course, and the hangar off there on the right. Worth noting, actually, just earlier today, there was a new filing with the Federal Aviation Administration. Let's see if I can pull it up real quick here, if I've still got that open, where the filing did suggest that SpaceX is going to be bringing one of the super tall LR 1300 cranes out to Launch Complex 39A to add an additional segment onto the roof, or to the top of the tower. Yes, let's see, I've got it here. They're bringing the LR 11,000 crane to install the tower roof, with that work beginning potentially as early as June 16th. So good bit of activity going to be happening out here at the Kennedy Space Center, as SpaceX is hoping potentially to start launching their Starship rockets from here in Florida, maybe as early as late this year. I would say probably early 2027 is a safer bet. But Stephen, I guess just your thoughts on the tower and the launch pad side of this whole equation.
Yeah, I think that's a key part of it, because this is the design that they want to extend to all their other launch sites, and the architecture here needs to be proven out at Starbase, to make sure that they're on the right path for what they're building at 39A and Pad 37 and potentially other sites down the road. So, of course, we saw the first flight of Starship back in 2023 did a number on that launch pad, and they had to repair that. It took around 6 months or so to repair it and get it back ready for Flight 2 of Starship back in 2023. So there's a lot they've learned since then. I don't expect that to be a problem today. They've had a static fire with 33 engines with no issues. So not expecting anything like that today, but the proof's in the pudding, and that's when they fly.
Well, speaking of when they fly, we are now within an hour potentially of them flying. This is the first time today that we've actually seen the clock tick down to within 1 hour of a potential liftoff. So hopefully that's a good sign that things are moving along a little bit more smoothly now. Perhaps if they were trying to ride out some less than ideal weather, that things are lining up for them, and hopefully we'll see SpaceX confirm that they are good to go for the start of prop load today. As a reminder to folks who may have missed our discussion of the fueling timeline, SpaceX will make the call on the start of prop load coming up here now in just about 9 minutes at T-minus 50 minutes. And then if that go ahead is granted, things will start with a loading of liquid oxygen on the ship upper stage. And that begins at T-minus 38 minutes and 53 seconds. So we're getting close to things really starting to materially move here out at Starbase, which is good to see.
Yeah, so we're about 9 minutes away from that go, no-go point in the countdown, where the launch director gives their approval, hopefully, to proceed into propellant load this evening.
And for folks that are wondering if we're going to be hearing that go, no-go call, the answer to that is unfortunately no. SpaceX is starting their coverage in the roughly 45-minute time frame before they're set to lift off. So we'll have SpaceX views and updates outside of X within that final 45-minute pocket, which is good because that's the full width and breadth of the fueling timeline, which will be nice to see, especially since this is the first time they're fueling a version 3 rocket with the intent of launching. And, as we've seen with previous iterations of Starship, they've both changed the time it takes to fuel as well as the order in which that they're loading prop. I mean, we've seen them start with fuel, we've seen them start with LOX, go back and forth, still trying to find that exact sweet spot. So we'll see if this flow of operations, if you will persist beyond Flight 12, or if this is potentially a one-and-done fueling timeline that we're seeing here today. Lots that SpaceX and all of us are going to be learning about this mission and about this rocket.
Yep, excitement guaranteed, as SpaceX likes to say.
Excitement guaranteed, indeed.
I think one thing to note, maybe it's a little trivial, but with Falcon 9, of course, we see the booster, the first stage, begin propellant loading before the second stage. And on this timeline, we're seeing the ship, the upper stage, loaded first with liquid oxygen, and then the booster following that a few minutes later.
Yeah, it's certainly interesting to see that they're starting with the ship upper stage as opposed to starting with the booster, potentially just because of the sheer volume of LOX that needs to be on the Super Heavy, and they want to keep that as chilled as possible with the timeline to launch, and that's just what they've determined is sort of the sweet spot there for this type of launch vehicle as opposed to a Falcon 9. Worth noting for folks that maybe this is your first time watching a Starship launch and you've been with us or with Steven before I was at Spaceflight Now and seen a number of Falcon 9 launches. Worth noting that Starship does have the ability to hold the count as opposed to a Falcon 9 or a Falcon Heavy rocket, for which once fueling starts, that is that's the ball game right there. They either launch or they don't. Here they have the ability to hold at the 40-second mark. We are seeing a big vent here from the tower as SpaceX continues to condition the feed lines at the pad before progressing into lock load on the ship upper stage. So given the timing that we've seen this before with previous iterations of the Starship rocket, this should be a good visual indication that they are getting ready to progress into loading locks on the upper stage, which from where we are in the timeline to where that would happen, we're just about it'll be 16-ish minutes from the start of ship lock load. Yeah, about 16 minutes.
Yep.
And again, we'll be seeing different views coming from SpaceX in addition to the ones that we've been providing here. This one courtesy of our friends over at Avid Space, formerly Lab Padre, and the other view, which we can show you here in just a moment, from our friends Chuck and Jen Briggs with C&J Images, and we appreciate both of those teams for helping us out with our live coverage today. Speaking of helping us out with coverage, certainly want to thank the nearly 20,000 of you who are watching along with us live here this evening. If you haven't already, you could do us a big solid just by clicking that like button and sharing the stream, allowing some more folks to find their way into this live launch coverage. And of course, you can follow Stephen Clark over at Ars Technica, is where you can find his reporting. And on social, he's at X at Stephen Clark 1. And Stephen, you've been, of course, busy not only tracking the progress of the Starship program, but your sort of area of focus with Ars Technica on the space beat also kind of lines a little more closely into the defense side of things. And while Starship doesn't have per se missions lined up like they do for Falcon 9 and Heavy for the National Security Space Launch Program, the Department of Defense does have their eye on Starship and its potential capabilities when it comes to things like point-to-point cargo transfer and potentially future operations. From conversations that you've been having over, say, the past year, how are folks in the Space Force and Space Systems Command kind of feeling about how Starship is progressing?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interest on the military side in Starship, and not just the point-to-point application, but actually for launch and in-space transportation and all sorts of applications, because the 100+ ton payload capacity that SpaceX advertises for this version of Starship would be able to potentially, conceivably, deploy an entire constellation of satellites for the Department of Defense or the Space Force, or the National Reconnaissance Office. So it's really a step change in performance from any other rocket, not just SpaceX's previous Falcon 9. And it'll be interesting. There's going to be another competition that Space Systems Command is going to be hosting or launching, so to speak, about 2 years from now, which will be the next version of National Security Space Launch, Phase 4. And I'm really intrigued to see whether, I suspect SpaceX will propose Starship likely alongside Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy as an option for launching some of these national security missions. Whether or not the Space Force selects it probably depends a lot on how flights like this one go over the next year or two. So one thing that I think SpaceX still needs to develop for Starship is a more sophisticated payload accommodation, payload fairing, or payload deployment system.
I was just about to ask, is the DoD, I mean, they obviously don't talk a lot about specifics when it comes to their payloads, but are they kind of angling towards what could be deployed in the flat pack satellite style, sort of a la Starshield, but on a grander scale, or are they really waiting to see that sort of clamshell opening style fairing for Starship?
I think they're going to want to see a more classic payload accommodation for Starship, whether it's a clamshell or something out the side or a door that opens out the side. I don't know. The flat panel design really doesn't work for every application. You know, you can't launch a keyhole satellite that is a flat panel without some breakthrough in physics or design that would likely cost the military a lot of money. But they want to take advantage of the low cost per kilogram that Starship promises. So, you know, deploying things like you know, data relay satellites, missile tracking satellites, potentially even space-based interceptors, as well as surveillance satellites that are not quite as exquisite, could potentially fit into that payload deployment system. But you know, I really do think at some point SpaceX, if they're even interested in serving that market, which again, based on their S1 document, that is a very small fraction of their projected revenue over the next coming years. So you know, maybe it's a question of whether that's even a market they want to serve for some of these rare, more exquisite, large payloads. But I do think SpaceX, I'm kind of thinking out loud there, but I do think SpaceX does want to do that because they've talked a lot about launching large diameter telescopes, for example, on Starship and stuff like that. And for big spacecraft such as that, they will need a different type of payload deployment system, or payload accommodation than we've seen with Starship so far. Of course, the Starship version 4 that we've seen teased from SpaceX is even taller, which potentially could have a larger payload accommodation in terms of volume with a larger door. That's TBD at this point. But yeah, the Space Force is very interested in Starship, and you mentioned point-to-point transportation. Of course, that's a program that the Air Force Research Laboratory has with SpaceX right now. They haven't done any flight testing, but they do have a contract with SpaceX to investigate potential cargo delivery for you know, point-to-point cargo delivery anywhere in the world within an hour, basically using Starship in the future.
And not to shift too hard in our conversation here, but just want to note within the last minute, SpaceX did confirm that they are go for prop load. So good sign. Teams are progressing towards giving this a real shot of launching Starship version 3 for the first time. As you can see, the big vent continues on there at the tower. That should taper off before the LOX starts to flow on the ship upper stage. And again, that will begin at T minus 38 minutes, 53 seconds before the planned liftoff. So things are really starting to materialize here for SpaceX on Flight 12. Again, if they do need to hold the count, they can do so, at least with the previous iteration of Starship. The count was able to be held at T minus 40 seconds for several minutes or so. We presume that that is still the case with this version of Starship. We'll have to wait and get confirmation from SpaceX once they begin their commentary, and we can get some additional color on that as well. But we're assuming that if they need a little bit more of a buffer once prop load does get underway, that they will have that. And again, fueling will begin with the ship liquid oxygen load on the upper stage in now less than 10 minutes, about 8 minutes from now, as a matter of fact. Also worth noting, of course, Stephen Clark is one of team over at Ars Technica that covers a whole bevy of technology, and his colleague Eric Berger also closely monitoring this mission and was able to garner a response from SpaceX founder and CEO Elon Musk within the last couple of minutes here or so. And I'll just quote him here in response to Eric. He says, quote, "There's a large pipeline of V3 ships and boosters in the factory. The delay from the last launch was due to the almost total redesign of the primary structure, engines, electronics, and launch tower from V2. Failure today will not affect schedule by more than a month or so," end quote. And so, you know, Elon Musk sort of building upon what was also in the S1 document, which was to say that, this is really the dawn of the Starship version 3 era for them, that they've got, as we've seen with some of the video released by SpaceX in their, new docu-series, that there's a lot of pieces of hardware coming down the pipeline. And in fact, when they had the rupture with booster 18 during the road to a cryoproof test over at their Massey's test site, they were able to put booster 19, stack it, and then get it into flow less than a month later. And then when they had the 10-engine static fire test of booster 19, and they had to remove all the engines from that, they were able to backfill engines from booster 20 into booster 19. So as we've seen with SpaceX before, it's sort of illustrative of how hardware rich they are, as they like to say, and the ability to move pieces on the chessboard as needed to make sure that things, I guess, stay as close as possible. I'll phrase it like that, to the planned timeline. But Stephen, even at that, as we've been talking about during the broadcast here, I mean, during the May 2025 Starship talk that Musk held down at Starbase, I mean, he was talking about version 3 making a debut last year, and here we are, almost in the middle of 2026 before we even see version 3 fly. He talked about that they've got a lot of hardware in flow, but in your mind, how important is it that this flight more mirrors Flight 11 than mirrors Flight 7, if you will?
That's an interesting question, because I was thinking, when you're thinking about the examples of how quickly SpaceX can turn and recover from a failure or a problem, my mind went back to this time last year with version 2, with those 3 consecutive launch failures in January, March, and May of 2025. Those were launched roughly 2 months apart, despite each one of those being really serious failures, and that SpaceX really had to fix. And it took them 3 flights to fix it, and then they had a couple of largely successful flights toward the end of the year. But if something like that happens again today with version 3, launching a couple of months from now does not seem out of the realm of possibility. Of course, that ends up being a 2-month delay to the program, or a 1-month delay in Elon's in his post on X a few moments ago. And every day counts at this point, especially for NASA trying to get to the moon.
Yeah, and as you're seeing here, we're also now getting views from SpaceX. So, sort of splitting my mind listening to what SpaceX is saying as they're making their introductory comments here. But prop load is just about to get underway, as we're currently T-minus 42 minutes, 35 seconds and counting to the planned liftoff. Of course, we'll let you know if there are any relevant updates to bring into the broadcast here as far as health of the hardware, notable updates that come out from the SpaceX broadcast. But so far, things seem to be progressing well towards liftoff here. As you take a look back down at the base of the rocket, you can see those 33 Raptor 3 engines that are getting ready to ignite for the very first time in support of a launch here. It's quite the sight, Stephen.
Yeah, it's really gorgeous, and the appearance of this new launch pad certainly looks a lot cleaner and more mature than what we saw in the last couple of years over at the adjacent launch pad. Really, we just saw a really cool view of the Raptor engines on the booster there. Really, really cool to see, and on the ship.
Yeah, and to see down to the integrated hot stage there for just a moment without the hot stage ring. I mean, it's quite interesting that, part of the protection from the fuel tank, and the super heavy booster comes from the pressure itself, and an additional piece of non-structural steel, and that those two combined will do what that massive hot stage ring did in protecting the top of the booster.
Yep, it still does have kind of a steampunk look to it, though, with the stainless steel in there. But obviously that system has worked, I think, on every flight. The hot staging system has worked without issue since they started that on Flight 2.
Yeah, since that introduction, I think it was on Flight 2, if I remember correctly, when they first flew the hot stage ring.
I believe you're right. Yep.
In this aerial view, you're getting a look, well, for a moment at Pad 1, which is down for a while as they will reconfigure it to be more like Pad 2 that you're seeing here, which has a bidirectional flame diverter as opposed to that metal deluge plate that was over underneath the orbital launch mount of Pad 1. Sort of a, I guess, an oxymoronic name given that it didn't actually support an orbital flight, but, semantics, I suppose. 40 minutes remaining on the count here. We're now less than 2 minutes away from the start of LOX beginning to flow on the ship upper stage. Let's go ahead and listen into SpaceX's Dan Hewitt here for a second just to get an update on the count here.
The range, the weather, everything as we count down to liftoff. We're going to be getting into prop load in just a couple of minutes, and we are counting down to a liftoff at 6:30 p.m. Central Time. The weather is great. We haven't had a blue sky all day. There you can see almost nothing but that. We were fighting some upper level winds a little bit earlier. That's why we moved into our launch window. But the great news is we are looking go for launch. Also, we're monitoring the range, so air and sea space out in the Gulf and also in the Indian Ocean on the other side of the world, not tracking any issues there. Now, today's countdown functionally going to look pretty similar to most people. There's a couple of differences in timing for some of those major milestones, like when we start loading propellant, when the diverter turns on and the water's flowing, when the engines start up. But otherwise, other than that, all of the hardware brand new. New booster, new ship, new engines, new pad. Let's nerd out. Let's dive right into it. So there it is on the pad. Say hello to Starship version 3. As Kate noted, some of the outside might look familiar, but we've made extensive upgrades across every single system. Start with the big picture because Starship still very, very big. Just over 407 feet tall, fully stacked, a little bit taller than version 2. With that extra stretch, we can carry even more propellant, but big rocket. The bottom half is our super heavy booster. And there are some pretty visible structural changes on the outside. We'll jump in. You've got version 3 on the left there, version 2 on the right. At the very top, we've changed from a one-time use hot stage adapter that used to pop off to one that's fully integrated for reusability. And Starship's Raptors are actually going to be igniting directly on top of the booster's fuel tank. The fuel tank pressure itself and then a non-structural layer of steel, it's what's protecting the top of that booster when we do hot stage separation. Moving down a little bit, we went from 4 grid fins to 3. We made them 50% bigger and higher strength. Just a reminder, that's what booster is using to kind of steer itself as it's flying back for a catch. We're also now going to use those grid fins for lift and catch itself. We zoom in a little bit and you can see new catch points now on those grid fin structures. Moving inside the rocket, we redesigned the fuel transfer tube. This is the really big tube inside the rocket that's moving all of that liquid methane down to the Super Heavy's 33 Raptor engines. It's going to help us flip faster, and we can now start up all of the engines simultaneously. This thing is big. It's about the size of a Falcon 9 first stage, which gives us the fun realization that we kind of put a rocket inside of our rocket. The very bottom of the booster looks very different. You've got those new Raptor 3 engines that enabled us to delete the bulky heat shields, the engine shrouds that we had on the previous generation. And then all of the propulsion, avionics hardware for those engines are super tightly integrated now and protected by much slimmer shielding. Move on up, second stage. This version of Starship is designed to carry massive orbital payloads. We're talking up to 100 metric tons to Earth orbit, the Moon, and Mars. The biggest changes are pretty much all under the hood. We gave the propulsion system a clean sheet redesign. increased the propellant tank volume, and improved our reaction control system, our steering while we're on orbit. When we X-ray inside, the PEZ dispenser is now supercharged, a little bit of turbo, and that's going to allow us to increase the deploy speed for each of those satellites. Today, we're actually flying the heaviest payload we've ever carried on Starship, but eventually we're going to launch with up to 60 of those Starlink V3 satellites. Just below that, just below the payload bay and also down in the aft part of the ship, we've added new docking ports. That's going to enable us to link up in orbit between two starships, do propellant transfer. We also modified that main connection point where we load propellants into the vehicle for those future prop transfer missions. So a lot of upgrades tip to tail on the rocket, but powering everything, the Raptor 3. There they are, ripping in real time. These engines manufactured in Hawthorne, California, tested at our site up in McGregor. We redesigned their entire ignition system. We bumped up the thrust, so putting out more force, went from 230 to 250 tons force on those sea level engines, 258 all the way up to 275 on the vacuum optimized ones. When you look at all of the generations of Raptor lined up, all of those fiddly bits, the sensors, feed lines, controllers, everything that you were used to seeing around Raptor 1 and 2, a lot of those have either been deleted, best part is no port, or they're internally integrated and protected inside of the engine itself. That'll let us dramatically cut down on the weight of the engine, make it easier to manufacture because we are going to be mass producing these things. Now, we make these Raptors in Hawthorne. There's our Hawthorne manufacturing team getting ready to see their engines fly in space for the very first time. Huge shout out to you guys. You're all wizards. Appreciate you getting us some vehicles on the pad today. But incredible amount of effort. World's best engineering team works here at SpaceX. Get this rocket to that pad ready to launch. And we've been trying to follow more of it and document some of it. And if you haven't seen it, check out our new docu-series, Starship.
And we're going to peel away from that since looks like SpaceX is bringing in some potentially copyrighted music when they're teasing their docu-series about Starship. But a lot of great information there from SpaceX's Dan Hewitt. Worth noting where we are in the count, currently T-minus 33 minutes, 33 seconds. SpaceX has begun ship LOX load as well as booster LOX load that began at the T-minus 35 minute mark, and also just stepped into fuel loading on the Super Heavy booster. Coming up in about 30, actually less than 15 seconds time will be the start of ship fuel load getting underway. So lots of good progression here on tanking for the Starship Super Heavy rocket down there at Pad 2 with all those big changes that Dan was describing that have been folded into the launch vehicle here, getting ready to make its debut from Pad 2 today. Just a little more than half an hour remaining on the clock.
The solar system and
after the loading of fuel begins, or has actually just begun, the next major milestone will be the engine chill on both the Raptor engines for the ship upper stage as well as the Super Heavy booster. That happens at T-minus 21 minutes, 30 seconds. That's about 2 minutes earlier than previously we've seen on Starship version 2. And that'll be followed by a fairly quiet period as far as new activities on the SpaceX timeline to liftoff. There will be about a 20-minute period where SpaceX is just continuing to tank until we get to the end of prop load on the booster, just shy of 3 minutes to the count. And ship prop load on the upper stage wraps up at T-minus 2 minutes and 10 seconds. So, Stephen, we've heard about a number of those changes that SpaceX was talking about in the run-up to the mission, but your thoughts about, seeing that, nice sort of graphics package that SpaceX put together.
Yeah, really cool video, Will, and I think that's it kind of explains some of the changes. We talked about all of those a few minutes ago, but to see the visuals really helped explain, I think, to the viewers what version 3 is compared to the previous versions of Starship and Super Heavy. So really getting a good look at what the engines look like. You know, those black engines without the heat shield, without those engine pods to protect adjacent engines from failures, really has an entirely different look. And of course, it's a lot of mass savings for this rocket to be able to carry heavier payloads to orbit.
Yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see how those newly redesigned engines perform at startup, if they have a good boost back burn. And again, for folks out there, the booster is not going to go through a catch attempt. It will splash down in the Gulf, and the ship upper stage will also splash down in the Indian Ocean as well. So no catches by the tower this time, potentially with Flight 13, but that is very, very much TBD at this point in time. Just about half an hour remaining on the count so far, and things are continuing to progress well here. The final 30 minutes. Do want to thank the more than nearly 24,000 of you who are watching along with us live here today. If you haven't already, you could do us a big favor just by clicking that like button to help bring this broadcast to more folks as we're getting closer to the liftoff here in about 29 minutes' time. Getting a look at the version 3 satellite construction. This is actually one of the two tech demo satellites that is flying on board today. There are 20 simulator Starlink satellites that are flying that are similar to the ones we saw be deployed during flights 10 and 11. But there are two, that one of which we just saw, which are more fully built out and will allow for imaging of the Starship heat shield, which will give SpaceX engineers a good look from a third-person perspective, if you will, for the first time as ship is sort of in that mid-flight coast range, not too far after liftoff. So not while it's sort of taking the brunt of reentry. And we've seen SpaceX deploy drones and their little buoy cam out in the Indian Ocean to get those really good pictures and videos of ship coming back for a splashdown in the Indian Ocean. But this will give them some good visual data on the performance of the heat shield earlier in flight. And in fact, those Starlink satellites have a couple of aids on the heat shield. There are a series of the heat shield tiles that are painted white in order to allow for better calibration of those two augmented V3 simulator satellites that are flying on board, which, Stephen, I'm sure you're going to be just as eager as I am to see how all that plays out and, you know, what that imagery really looks like in practice.
Yeah, if that works, it's probably going to be something to add to the SpaceX highlight reel. That'll be really cool to see, those external views of the ship in space, if all things work during that sequence. We've seen the Pez dispenser in action before. One thing I noted from the SpaceX video we saw a few minutes ago was I think Dan Hewitt from SpaceX Communications mentioned that this deployment system has a turbocharge or supercharge to it, so it should be spitting out those satellite platforms or mock-up satellites a little faster than we saw on the previous flights with version 2. So can't wait to see that in action.
Yeah, faster actuating is definitely going to be a benefit to SpaceX. You know, last time they really talked about that, it was one Starlink per minute, so roughly a 60-minute deployment time for a full stack of 60 satellites, which, you know, compared to a Falcon 9 that lets them all go in one shot is quite a bit longer. So I imagine it would be better for all parties involved to be able to speed up that deployment timeline and then allow Starship to perform a deorbit burn and bring it back down to Earth, whether it's, you know, the earlier flights where it probably will be splashing down in one ocean or another, or, you know, eventually being caught back at the launch tower, which would be quite something.
Yeah, I expect a lot of great video from today's flight because I don't think SpaceX has said this, but you know, I suspect that part of the upgrades may have to do with the visuals or the comm system here, and Starlink becomes more capable with every Falcon 9 launch. So, it stands to reason that they should have even more throughput available to link up with Starship when it's in space on this flight, not to mention the upgrades on the vehicle itself.
Yeah, I mean, the last time that we saw Starship fly was back in mid-October. I think they had somewhere on the order of, oh gosh, I think it was like 8,600 Starlink satellites, maybe a little bit less around there on orbit. Now they're in excess of 10,000 and counting, as the weeks go by. So yeah, hopefully that all just stacks up to mean that the connectivity on the ship and those two Starlink V3 satellites will offer even crisper and more consistent video applications here. And certainly, as NASA is wanting to allow for 4K video during the Artemis 3 mission, it certainly is a good advertisement, if you will, for SpaceX to throw its name in the hat and, see how those chips fall.
Yep, I think you're exactly right, Will. And of course, SpaceX is unique that it has this massive rocket, has this massive proliferated constellation for broadband in space, and all under one roof. So they certainly have the advantage there.
Will be interesting to see. I mean, with these procurement opportunities, we really don't typically get a good sense of all the parties who throw their hat into the ring, unless they make sort of a big to-do about it, as we're sort of seeing both Rocket Lab and Blue Origin jockey for the Mars Telecommunication Orbiter contract, certainly. But, I do wonder if we may see a player like, Amazon Leo, for example, step up and really try to make a more overt public pitch for why their constellation should be looped into the Artemis 3 mission instead of Starlink. Maybe a tougher sell with 300 satellites versus 10,000 plus. But we'll see how that materializes.
I think always, don't hide my bias for having more competition. I think that's an easy thing to say, and so hopefully, somebody else steps up. Well, Amazon certainly seems to be the next in line behind SpaceX, but they're a distant second. So if Artemis 3 is going to fly next year, I think I think Starlink is certainly in the driver's seat for that contract at this point.
Although that's not to rule out the potential of a dark horse or something we're not expecting to make a bid, given that Viasat just launched their third Viasat 3 satellite that's getting on orbit, and in the very early stages of commissioning. That's obviously a geostationary constellation versus Starlink is in LEO, so it may or may not be positioned to do that, but we'll have to wait and see. We are getting a graphical representation here of the trajectory for today's mission, as the ship and Super Heavy booster will lift off here from Pad 2 at Starbase. And again, with integrated hot stage, there is no deployment of a hot stage ring this time, so that event not part of this graphics package. Booster is going to perform a little bit of a hover as it returns for a landing down in the Gulf. You can see the deployment of the simulator Starlink satellites in addition to the two operational ones. I got a new graphic for that. It's kind of nifty. There will also be a Raptor engine relight during the coast phase. That's about 37 minutes into the mission. And the ship will perform a staggered shutdown of its engines, going from 3 to 2, then 2 to 1, before it's planned to splash down in the waters of the Indian Ocean, as you can see to the northwest of the Australian continent. Currently at 21 minutes, 29 seconds and counting. Where we are in the fueling timeline actually is the chill down of the 39 Raptor engines, the 6 on the upper stage and the 33 on the booster. Let's go ahead and listen to Dan Hewitt.
the range out here in the Gulf and out in the Indian Ocean. As you can see, we have started our propellant load. That happened at about 36 minutes before T0. We're loading about 20% faster on pad 2 than we did on pad 1. Our flight director, Ty Huntington's back in the chair again. He was there for Starship's first flight test and 11 back for V3. He did that final go, no go at about T-minus 1 hour. We do start loading on ship first. That happened at about T-minus 37. Booster follows about 1 minute later, starting with its liquid oxygen and then its liquid methane. And then ship fuel is the last one to kick off at about T-minus 35. We're going to continue loading all of this propellant on board until about 3 minutes right before launch. 3 minutes 20 on ship, 2 minutes 50 on the booster. So we go pretty much right down to the wire. But as of this moment, still looking good. T0 set for 6:30 p.m. Central Time. Continuing to load prop, continuing to count down. All right. If you've been following along with these launches, you know we've been sending these suborbital and they splash down in the Indian Ocean. How the heck do we see some of that? Well, we have our recovery team, our Starship recovery team, and one of their primary jobs is to get those reentry views and a whole lot more. We're going to take them now. We're joining them out in the Indian Ocean. We've got Suren Sinai standing by, taking a moment from the recovery ops. He might be frozen. Let me know if you can hear me, Suren. How's everything looking out there in the ocean?
Dan, I can hear you loud and clear. We're sitting in about 8-foot waves, but it's looking like a clear day, ready for a ship to come on through.
All right, man. How many of these have you done? And like, walk us through. What's the recovery team's primary job out there?
I've done 6 and now 7 of these missions, and with every mission we've seen it evolve, and but our primary goal has always been to clear the range. So just like we do over in the Gulf, the same kind of happens here. We send 1 to 2 boats out and we make sure there's nothing in the area so that the rocket is clear to land. And then once we can guarantee that and have the rocket leave the pad, then we can proceed to imagery collection. So we have
All right, we'll see if we can get him back, but they're out there in the Indian Ocean. I think everyone's familiar. They've got the buoy cams. They've got the drones that are going to be going up, so we're going to be cutting back to them live once they get. They've been doing some practice stuff. We've been able to shoot some of this. So there you can see Suren getting those buoy boats. So they're basically out there. They're deploying these boats in the splashdown zone. If you get a live view from one of these boats, that tells you that we're pretty much nailing our target on that. And then Suren and a couple of our other recovery folks out there are going to be flying drones to hopefully get that imagery of Starship coming back. It's super critical for us to see just how that heat shield performed after reentry, and just having them out there remote, just in the middle of nowhere, plays just a really critical role in just rapid iteration on Starship and its heat shield. So looking forward to hopefully seeing some views from them a little bit later. But for now, let's head back down to Kate and Jake for the latest progress.
And some good updates there from SpaceX's Dan Hewitt with just under 17.5 minutes remaining before liftoff. And sounds like SpaceX is about to talk about some of their pad expansion, not only here at Starbase, as to getting the zoomed-in view from our friends Chuck and Jen Briggs. C&J Images down at Starbase for us today. Now a view from the folks at Avid Space, formerly Lab Padre.
The ongoing construction and development that will bring a second launch tower to Launch Complex 39A. You can see it ongoing there on your screen. It's designed to expand our capabilities to support Starship launches in the future, while also continuing to support Falcon Heavy missions from the original Apollo Shuttle Falcon launch tower.
Yeah, and we're also building a Starship launch pad at Slick 37. And to support the uptick in future launches, there's Gigabay, a giant assembly and maintenance facility designed to prep Starships ahead of Florida launches. And when complete, this huge structure aims to hold 24 work cells and over 800,000 square feet of workspace. That's 24 rockets under one roof. That's absolutely crazy.
Going to be so many.
Yeah. So SpaceX's future in Florida is quickly taking shape with our very first launches on the horizon.
Yes, a horizon that aims for regular trips to the moon. Now, staying with the lunar conversation, we're going to head back up to Dan, who has Starship Vice President of Engineering, Bill Riley, our favorite webcast visitor, to talk about the moon.
That's right, Kate. Yeah, crashing the webcast again. Bill Riley, VP of Starship Engineering. Thanks for coming, Bill. We wanted like a couple of minutes to geek out about the moon. Like Artemis 2 just flew humans around the moon for the first time in like 50 years, more than 50 years. I personally was wildly caught up in it. I don't know how you felt about the whole thing.
Yeah, I found it really inspirational. I think part of being a spacefaring civilization is being out there exploring, and I thought Artemis 2 got us back to the moon and back exploring and being out farther than we had been before.
It's always wild when you see space stuff kind of break through into the mainstream, and like it felt like that really did it. And I mean, that's going to continue happening. We're looking at a higher cadence of missions in Artemis, and Starship's obviously going to play a pretty big role in the entire Artemis program. But like, what's kind of next on the horizon?
I think what's exciting about Artemis 3 is you'll see the landers introduced now. So maybe we're talking to NASA about doing an Earth orbit rendezvous where the Starship-based lander could be in proximity to Orion or even more. I think that's really the next step. Prove out those landers close to home in Earth orbit, and then looking ahead, going to the moon.
And we're debuting V3 now, and just some of the stuff that's now on this version of Starship is going to directly enable some of that, or it's planned to, correct?
That's right. So V3 is exciting because it really introduces it's designed to introduce all these fundamental foundational features that allow us to go out past the Earth. So for example, there's many features, but some that are visible are the docking adapters below the PEZ door that you'll notice on the as-built ship. And then as we look out past V3, there's other configurations of Starship. There is a tanker that takes the propellant to dock with the lander that will land on the moon. And think of the on-orbit propellant transfer as sort of like the gas station in the sky. And then that gas station will be what we call the depot.
And then the plan now, and the plan's been, but it's really emphasized now, we're not just going for flags and footprints, we're talking permanent infrastructure on the moon, right?
That's right. We have to build up to that capacity. So the first landers will be, a new set of boot prints to kind of start a new generation of explorers. Then we'll build into cargo landers like you see here, maybe bringing down a rover to the surface. Some infrastructure might even be staying inside the landers. And then as we look to an even brighter future, having a permanent presence in a moon base.
Yeah, I'm ready for the moon base. I need to go to the moon. That's definitely in my it sounds like a hell of a week-long vacation or one heck of a trip. But and I mean, this is the next step on making life multiplanetary, right?
Absolutely. It's literally the next planetary body we need to get to. So.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Bill. I'm going to let you jump back in there as we get ready to launch this rocket. Thanks for nerding out on the moon with me for a couple of minutes. But we're not done. We got a little bit of more cool news. Stick around. Last year, the From 2 crew made history. They were the first astronauts ever to explore Earth's polar regions from space in Dragon. I got to catch up with that mission commander from that, Chun Wang. He was visiting one of the remote.
And we're currently T-minus 12 minutes, 13 seconds and counting to the planned liftoff of Starship Flight 12. A little bit of a tease there with some of the future plans for Starship, especially as it pertains to the Artemis program. But we also got to see a little bit more of a close-up view of some of the development of the Starship Tower that we were talking about earlier over at Launch Complex 39A, in addition to the Gigabay that's currently in development adjacent to the Hangar X site here at NASA's Kennedy Space Center. Stephen, a little bit more color, perhaps, but still, I felt myself wanting and just sort of on the edge of my seat to see, are they going to paint in some of the open areas? Will we get a number of target for prop loading? And we didn't get any of that, unfortunately. Your thoughts on the couple of presentations that we just saw there?
I think so many questions, and I really want to take this opportunity to say I really hope that in the push for transparency that Jared Isaacman has promised as NASA administrator, that we start to hear more from the contractors, and SpaceX included, and near the top of the list, but not just SpaceX, from Blue Origin, from Boeing on their plans for core stage production in the future, from ULA on how the Centaur 5 will be integrated with future Space Launch System vehicles. I know this is all in the early phase, but for some of those systems, like the Centaur 5, but other systems quite mature at this point, at least in terms of time that has elapsed since they won the contracts. And I hope that we do hear more from SpaceX and Blue Origin and the rest of the contractors on HLS, on Space Launch System, on Orion, as NASA and the U.S. taxpayers take this leap to the moon. And we've heard a lot from NASA, heard a lot from Jared Isaacman, to their credit, but they're not the only ones involved here. There's a strong partnership with commercial space and international space agencies as well. So I'd love to hear more from them.
Yeah, I will certainly echo all of what you just said. When we spoke with the administrator back in mid-February, we touched on, the fact that we've been hearing, or had been hearing at that point, broadly about this accelerated plan for, the HLS landers that was presented to NASA from SpaceX and from Blue Origin. And, he, abbreviating his comments there, but he said, essentially that a number of pieces of that, there was so much that he could say, there was so much that he can't say because of the level of competition that still exists with the HLS contract and who gets what mission first. But you have to think, though, at this point in time, sitting here, right before Memorial Day 2026, with potentially both landers supposed to be a factor for Artemis 3 coming up maybe mid next year, sounds like possibly late next year, but whenever it flies in 2027, or if it does end up slipping into 2028, I mean, we're knocking on the door of things really needing to crystallize for this mission, if for no other reason that the crew needs to, have some clarity on how they're training, what lander they're training on. I mean, the astronaut corps, I'm sure, has infinitely more insight than we, the public, does. But, if the momentum of Artemis 2 carries forward, it will be because we know what we're looking forward to and what we can expect from all these players. And, at the Ascend conference up in DC, we did get a panel from some of the leadership at Lockheed Martin talking about some of their plans for the Orion spacecraft, and the block upgrades that will be needed for that, working with the European Space Agency and the service module, needing to be vehicle agnostic to be able to fly on more than just the HLS. And so they're, you've seen Lockheed Martin kind of step up in that transparency space. But that's, not to knock that, it's certainly welcome that we know a lot about Orion. It's, been in development for 20 years, and, it's good to hear about where it's going in the future. But like you said, it's just one piece of the puzzle, and one that we know a whole lot about.
Right, and that's the most static part of the program at this point. Space Launch System is changing, ground systems are changing, HLS is changing, Moonbase is new, Gateway is canceled, and Orion's the one piece that really is changing relatively little over the next few years. So, so I'd love to hear from the rest of the contractor team, and it's really a shame that we don't have more interaction with them from an opportunity to ask questions of them and have an idea of where this is going. One thing I'll note from Bill Riley's talk just a couple of minutes ago, I don't want to be a wet blanket here, but he mentioned getting Starship and Orion in proximity to one another next year in orbit with Artemis 3. Did not mention a docking much less crew boarding the lander, which seems to already be in question from some NASA statements we've heard in the last couple of weeks. But perhaps even a docking in question, whether that will happen on Artemis 3 or if it's going to be a rendezvous and proximity operations type mission. And that as you start to descope some of the things that you would like to do with Artemis 3, it begs the question: is it really worth expending a $2 billion rocket on something that you may not learn a lot with? So, fair questions that I think deserve to be asked and answered from NASA and the contractors.
Yeah, and not to put words in the administrator's mouth, I would assume that if asked, an answer to that may be, and I'll recognize the danger of speaking for anyone, and so I will say this is my assumption with the caveat that I do not speak for or represent NASA in any way, shape, or form, but he's said previously that having a rocket that launches only every few years is really a detriment to the NASA workforce, and so wanting to get that cadence up for the sake of exploration ground systems, for the contractors that are involved with SLS, has its own value in and of itself. But to your point, Stephen, I mean, the point of in some framing adding a mission in 2027, in another framing reconfiguring Artemis 3 to be an Earth orbit mission as opposed to a moon landing, however you want to phrase it and think about it, it in large part is to buy down risk for a future landing. And if you're not even getting to the point of docking Orion to either Blue Moon or Starship, it seems to not quite do enough to then set the stage for a landing opportunity in 2028. But that's, maybe I'm seeing that wrong. We'll see.
Like I said, fair questions, and hopefully we have answers soon.
Well, speaking of things that are fair, it looks like there's some fair winds there at Starbase. Trying to find an elegant segue here and failing a little bit. But the prop load percentages on the booster and ship is moving along quite nicely, nearly 100% full on both stages of this two-stage, more than 400-foot tall rocket. The fueling milestones should wrap up within the third minute before liftoff. So in about 30 seconds time, we should hear that booster prop load has wrapped up, and that'll be followed by ship prop load just before the T-minus 2 minute mark. Coming up to the final 3 minutes of the count as things currently stand, and SpaceX did note that they do have that ability to hold within the final 40 seconds if needed. Past the 250 point. Just hearing SpaceX commentary, not the loops. So based off the timeline, they should be done with booster prop load. Ship prop load should be wrapping up in about 20 seconds. Commentator notes that at the T-minus 40 second point, if they need to hold, they can do so for about 5 minutes. SpaceX's Dan Hewitt saying they shut down the fuel pump to loading on the booster, so that, or the ship upper stage, that is wrapping up as well. Less than 2 minutes to the planned liftoff. Again, we're waiting to see within the next minute if they pass the T-minus 40 second mark. And they did note that if they pass 40 seconds and get into the deluge sequence, which begins at T-minus 17 seconds, they can pause and reload. But the closer they get to T-minus 10 seconds, the harder that becomes. T-minus 1 minute and counting. Passing the 40-second mark. Waiting to see if the launch director confirms go for launch. And they're in a hold. Again, they can hold here at the T-minus 40-second mark for about 5 minutes or so. They're checking the quick disconnect events. Clock is reset. Let's go ahead and listen into, and we've held again. Rapid recycle has kicked back in once again. Let's go ahead and listen in for the final minute of the count for any updates that come in, and we'll be back with you on the other side of what will hopefully be liftoff.
All right, still going to hang out for a couple of seconds here at T-minus 40. Again, not surprising. This is new vehicle, new pad, doing all these things for the very first time. Right now we are holding, looking at some pressures in the quick disconnect, and hold reset, and we're rolling.
Flight directors, go for launch.
And a confirmation of
back to
launch.
rapid recycle,
About
so we're
recycle
at T-minus 40 again. Hang tight for a second, we'll see what tripped this last one. As a reminder, we can hang out for quite a few minutes at T-minus 40 if we need the extra time. You're not actively loading propellant onto the vehicle anymore, so the main thing you're kind of keeping an eye on is all of the temperatures inside those propellant tanks. All right, we're continuing to hang out here at T-minus 40. Team's taking a look right now at our diverter, so that water diverter underneath the system did trip a hold, but that basically just gives the team the chance to look at it, see if it's something that we need to troubleshoot in data or if it's something that we can clear this hold. So continuing to hang tight, T-minus 40 seconds. Starship and Super Heavy fully loaded on the pad. Clock is rolling.
T-30, flight directors, go for launch.
Kick back to rapid recycle again. Again, just a reminder, said it before, new pad, new rocket, learning new things about this hardware performing in the flight environment. Taking a look at some of the sensors on the arm that manages the quick disconnect to the ship. promise we're not just trying to prolong the anticipation. Team's taking a look. We've got a couple more minutes where we can hang out here. Again, it's not an unlimited time to pause at T-minus 40. We're keeping an eye on the propellant temperatures inside the vehicles. So we've got probably about 3 minutes or so left of hold time. Team's taking a look at the hold that tripped on that arm for the quick disconnect on the tower. Continuing to hold, got a couple minutes to try and clear this issue. Still holding T-minus 40, still troubleshooting this issue. Probably got about a minute or a minute and a half left of hold time. Flight control team confirmed, still working through the issue. Still have a short amount of hold time still remaining. Still holding T-minus 40. All right, still continuing to hold here at T-minus 40. While we do that, the team's looking at temperatures of the propellant inside those tanks. We kind of check that against simulations that we've run in the past. There's some margin in those. We're still holding, no decision yet. Sounding like we have the fix in place. Hold reset, clocks is rolling. And we're back into rapid recycle. right, we're back at our T-minus 40 hold. Standing by to see what tripped us this time. All right, it is sounding like we are not going to be able to clear this issue in time today, so we are going to be standing down from a launch. So if you're just now joining us, we got the vehicle totally loaded. We hit a couple of different holds as we worked through that count. Again, new rocket, new pad. We're learning about a lot about these systems as we execute them for the first time, and we're not able to basically troubleshoot all of these issues in those final seconds to get to launch. But that essentially makes this a wet dress rehearsal. We were able to fully load the vehicles, and we're going to take the time now, figure out what tripped us up before launch, and then actually get into a flight tomorrow. We do have the ability to essentially rapidly recycle. We are expecting to be able to make another flight attempt tomorrow, but obviously stay tuned to our social media at SpaceX on.
And of course, a disappointing end to what appeared to be in the final few minutes. Very promising first bite at the apple for Starship version 3, but as you heard from SpaceX's Dan Hewitt, they are standing down from a launch attempt today, just couldn't clear all the issues in time to proceed. They did know that they have the potential for a launch tomorrow. However, we've been hearing that weather opportunities or weather conditions for an opportunity tomorrow are not terribly favorable. So we'll wait and see if SpaceX formally announces that a launch attempt on Friday is in fact forthcoming, or if the case may be, they may need to pause and pivot and reposition to the other side of the Memorial Day holiday here in the United States. That's, of course, a 3-day weekend and would likely see Cameron County down in South Texas keep the beach open through the weekend onto Monday, which would quite likely preclude SpaceX from trying to launch on Saturday, Sunday, or Monday. But again, that's a little bit of assumption here. We'll have to wait and see what actually materializes in the next 24 hours or so. But Stephen, just to bring you back in here before we let you go this afternoon, early evening, I suppose now at this hour, almost 8 o'clock here on the East Coast. Not terribly unexpected, given that this was, involving a lot of changes to the rocket, a lot of changes to the launch infrastructure, but, still disappointing, I imagine, for the SpaceX team in your mind, right? To get so close and then have Lucy pull the football away right at the kick.
Yeah, kind of a rare scrub for Starship with SpaceX down at Starbase. Lots of drama there. Was it 4 or 5 attempts inside 40 seconds and then a recycle, and couldn't quite get there. But these things. This is the space business. I'm sure people there in person are disappointed. SpaceX team's probably disappointed they didn't fly today, but it's the better part of valor. I think if the hardware was talking to them, wasn't quite ready, needs some more time to understand what's going on. So it'll fly, whether it's tomorrow or next week, and we'll be here.
We certainly will. It's a very important space story that you and I and our colleagues in the space industry will continue to stay on top of, and of course bring you the very latest here at Spaceflight Now. And we'll of course have another dedicated live stream, as you just saw today, on Starship Flight 12 whenever that ends up materializing here on the calendar, whether that is tomorrow or next week, or if it takes additional troubleshooting, we'll be back when they are ready to fly. In the meantime, of course, there are a number of missions on SpaceX Ledger, as well as for other space companies. You've got a rocket lab aiming to launch on the 22nd, and then coming up next week, you've got Falcon 9 rocket launches scheduled for right now the 24th, 25th, 28th, 29th, June 1st, June 3rd, and June 4th. So even though we didn't get our fill of a launch today, it'll come soon enough, and there's plenty others to wet your whistle, if you will, on the orbital launch front. So never fear, we'll have plenty more live streams coming down for you. But want to give a big thank you to our friend and colleague over at Ars Technica, Stephen Clark. Stephen, again, thank you for joining us, and we'll look forward to having you back again whenever we're ready to run it back.
Hey, of course, anytime. Exciting day, even though they didn't fly, it's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to talk space with you. And if we don't have a launch attempt before then, have a good weekend. And want to thank all of you who have been watching with us today, the tens of thousands of folks who joined us in our live stream here this afternoon into the evening. We certainly appreciate your time and attention. Want to give a big thank you to all of the moderators who've been helping us out in the live chat space. Thanks to Jeff Hansen, to let's see, we had a few different moderators here. I don't want to leave anybody out, so just give a broad thanks to all the mods who were helping us out, and want to thank the folks who helped support our coverage through the YouTube Super Chat feature. I know we didn't get to really many of them as we normally do with a broadcast. There's a lot to talk about with this show today, so I do want to give a quick mention to Mitchell Wilbur for a very generous $50 Super Chat. Says, looking forward to investing in SpaceX. We were talking about the initial public offering. Says, I love this stuff. Can't think of a better channel to support. Will and all the mods and everyone that makes it happen are the best. And want to thank all of our new and recurring channel members, the folks that gifted channel members as well. Big thank you to all of you, and to our team here at Spaceflight Now, to our friends Chuck and Jen Briggs with C&J Images down there at Starbase, to our friends at Avid Space for helping support us with these great views of the Starship rocket and Pad 2, and to our team here of Adam Bernstein, John Pisani, Michael Kane, and of course our editor, Stephen Young. Thanks one more time to our guests, to Stephen Clark of Ars Technica, to Micah Maidenberg for sharing their time and expertise with us today. Most importantly, though, thanks to you for wherever you've been watching from. We certainly appreciate your time and attention, and look forward to welcoming you back in here when next we have a launch to cover. For all of us here at Spaceflight Now, I am Will Robinson Smith. Remember, be good to yourselves, be good to others. We will see you next time, folks. And if we don't see you before the weekend closes out, have a happy and safe weekend. Bye-bye.